it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Night Prowler by Jrubas. Part 1. Kevin Turner threw back his head and let out a long groan. Before him, spread out across the coffee table, the scattered papers of the Mancini file stared mockingly at him. Statements, crime scene photos, blah, blah, blah. Sighing, Kevin rubbed his grainy eyes. It was barely 9:30, but he'd been going over the mess of papers since he got home at 4, and he felt like he was going to conk out right here. A tall, thin man with grey and brown hair and stubble that seemed to always crop up no matter how much he shaved. Kevin was sitting between the couch and the coffee table, his shirt sleeves rolled up and empty containers of Chinese food close at hand. His blue eyes were faded and bleary, and when he moved his head, a twinge of pain streaked up the back of his neck. He was only 41, but some days he felt older. Other days, when he was working on a big case, he felt younger, stronger, as though he could go for days on end without rest. Until he actually tried to, that is, and then he turned into a sleepy grump with a headache and coffee breath. He looked at the papers in front of him, and his eyes crossed, vision blurring. All right, he thought sourly. Fine, I'll knock off for the day. Happy? Well, no, he wasn't. Kevin was the type of man who, once he got involved in a project, couldn't pull himself away until it was finished. If he tried, it would haunt his mind and nestle like cold grease in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't sleep well when something was undone, and his thoughts would always go back to it, even at the most inappropriate moments. A door slammed, and Kevin jumped. "Oh, geez, Dad," Dylan said. He was standing by the kitchen island, a can of Coke raised partly to his lips. He was tall, like Kevin, but thinly built, with a sweep of chestnut-brown hair and soft hazel eyes, both of which came from Michelle. He was wearing ripped jeans, a black band tee, and a short-waisted leather jacket. "Why are you all dressed up?" Kevin asked. Dylan rolled his eyes like Kevin was an idiot. Maybe he was. The show? For a moment, Kevin had no idea what the boy was talking about, and then it hit him. Oh, shit. Dylan played in a band with a couple of his friends. Well, if you could even call it a band. That wasn't a knock against his son, but they didn't even play instruments. They had a laptop and headphones, and that was about it. Dylan was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge when it came to new wave, dance, K-pop, house, electronica, and other strange music that Kevin had always thought was dumb, but he knew next to nothing about other genres. Can you believe this guy thought Nirvana was a 70s folk band? He and his band had been together for 3 years, playing nights and weekends in the garage. Well, they were pretty good, Kevin thought, and that was only half bias. But tonight was their first real show, at a bar in Santa Monica, and Kevin wanted to be there. Dylan was grinning. "No, you can't come." It wasn't a question. Kevin opened his mouth to speak, to make some excuse or justification, just as he had a million times before, but Dylan cut him off. "It's okay, really. I mean, who wants their old man hanging around anyway?" Well, it was supposed to be a joke, but it hurt Kevin. He could see a faint glimmer in Dylan's eyes, and to him it looked like disappointment. Well, disappointment was a look he was used to seeing in his son's eyes. Being a homicide detective meant missing out. Little league games, school plays, birthday parties. In an instant, Kevin's mind flashed back over all the events he'd missed, all the memories, and his heart clenched. "Yeah, I'll be there," he always told himself, but he wound up working instead, so lost in the pursuit of justice that hours passed like minutes. "Oh, I'm sorry," Kevin heard himself saying, slipping into the apology like an old glove. It occurred to him he'd said those 2 words to Dylan more than he'd said anything else to him. Dylan smiled. "Really, it's fine. Don't beat yourself up about it." He finished the soda and tossed it into the trash can. He slapped the quartz counter and pointed at Kevin. "Yeah, I'll see you later." Kevin muttered something as Dylan walked out. He turned back to the coffee table and sighed. God, I'm a failure, he thought. A failure as a father. Looking at the papers, Kevin felt a wave of disgust wash over him. God, you already miss your son growing up? You're going to miss everything else too. Well, when I finish this case, he thought, yeah, I'll make it up to him. But truth be told, he was tired of having to make it up to Dylan. Just not tired enough to stop. Dylan Turner lit a cigarette and leaned against the stone mailbox as he waited for his ride. He took a deep drag, held it, and let it out slowly. Blue smoke hung in the dry air like nuclear fallout over a black, bomb-blasted hellscape. He scanned the houses on the other side of the street, all stucco siding and terracotta roofs, wilted palms overhanging brown front lawns that crunched when you walked across them. Oh, another summer, another drought. He pinched the filter between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, pulled it away from his lips with a flourish, and blew another plume. Yeah, it's okay, Dad, I don't mind, he'd said. I don't care that you never have time for me. It's totally fine, man, really. But it wasn't fine. It was the opposite of fine. Well, maybe it isn't cool to want your father's approval. Maybe it isn't cool to want to hang out with him and shit like that. But Dylan honestly didn't give a fuck what was cool. It really hurt that Dad never had time for him. It hurt that every time he went to go see if they could do something together, he got shot down again and wound up feeling 2 inches tall. Yeah, it hurt bad. Taking another drag, he glanced down the street as a pair of headlights appeared, creeping slowly forward. It drew closer, and he recognized Sean's Trans Am. He flicked the cigarette away as the car pulled up and went to the passenger side door, pulling it open and climbing in. Sean, black with short dreadlocks, sat behind the wheel, a satisfied little grin on his face. Hey, man, Sean said as Dylan slammed the door behind him. You ready for this? Oh, I'm ready, Dylan said. I've been ready a while. Well, not as long as I have, Lyra said from the back seat. She leaned forward and kissed Dylan on the cheek. Tall, with long dark hair and freckles, she was older than Dylan by 6 months, a fact that she'd never let him forget. Sometimes he wondered why he put up with her. Then they had sex and he remembered. Dylan turned his head and their lips brushed. Her eyes were big and sparkly in the semi-darkness. She was more excited for this than him and Sean combined. She pecked his mouth and drew away with a laugh when he stuck his tongue out and licked her bottom lip. None of that, man, she said. It's bad luck to French before a show. Who the hell told you that? He asked as Sean pulled away from the curb. Oh, common knowledge, dude, she said. Well, Dylan snickered. Yeah, common knowledge, totally. As the car crept away, Dylan spared one last look at the house, catching a fleeting glimpse of a shadow in one lighted window. It might not be cool to be disappointed that your dad can't come to your show, but Dylan was really disappointed, and if that made him lame, then he was lame. Super, mega lame. At 11:58 p.m. on the evening of June 28th, the killer left the freeway and followed Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard west toward Limert Park, passing shopping centers and restaurants flanked by tall, wavering palms and low, bushy tangles of California live oak. Though it was nearly midnight, the streets were alive with activity, the night haunted by pimps, pushers, and prostitutes. In front of a 24-hour grocery, a group of black men talked and took turns drinking from a bottle. As he passed, the killer thought of opening fire on them and speeding off, but decided against it. The wind fluttered his long, scraggly hair, and his Coke bottle glasses slid down his nose. They were too big for his face, but he wore them anyway. Yeah, he had his reasons. After several blocks, he turned onto Southwestern Avenue, which ran past Martin Luther King Elementary and Martin Luther King Park. Lots of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it tells you what kind of neighborhood this is. Before coming to Exposition Boulevard, the killer swung onto West 38th Street, a short wide avenue lined with small middle-class homes, their yards tiny and fenced in, their pitched terracotta roofs reaching for the mess of power lines overhead. He parked at the curb behind an old Monte Carlo and killed the engine, leaving the radio on. Motley Crue was singing Looks That Kill. The killer lit a cigarette and inhaled. The smoke made lazy whirls in the summer air. The killer liked Motley Crue. He liked most of the classic metal bands, even Dokken. Well, compared with the shit on the radio now, even Bon Jovi was good. The killer liked a lot of things, not just music. He liked reading, for one. At home he had a library dedicated to serial killers, mass murderers, and mobsters. Oh, and he also liked attention. Oh, yes. How nice to rise above the masses. To be someone in a world of vacant-eyed no-ones. At one time he thought he might be a musician or a writer, hell, even a politician. He could do it too. He could make the world love him. But infamy, the killer decided, is better than fame. Fame fades, but infamy doesn't. Who knows Greta Garbo, Fatty Arbuckle? No one, that's who. But everyone knows Hitler. People will never forget a man like that. And not only did they never forget, they became obsessed. They loved reading about it. It fed something in them. Oh, they smiled and tucked their shirts in, but when they got behind closed doors, they were all just as sick as they said he was. The only difference is that he was done playing society's game. Bundy, Dahmer, and Gacy had found their fortunes, and tonight the killer would find his. The books, the movies, the TV specials, all of it would be his. He tittered at the thought of what was to come. He especially looked forward to the climax. Across the street, a battered Chevy pulled into the driveway of a small stucco house, its headlights washing across the garage. Two women tumbled out, a short brunette and a tall blonde. The blonde said something to the driver and laughed. The car then backed into the street, swung left, and honked. As it passed, the killer got a good look at the guy inside. Middle-aged, bald, glasses. The girls let themselves into the house, switching on a light as they went, the dark windows suddenly afire. The killer took a drag and watched. He'd been watching the house for nearly a week, and he knew the rituals of the inhabitants better than he knew his own. There were 3 of them, all students at the University of Southern California. The blonde and brunette worked at a restaurant waiting tables. The redhead worked for the newspaper, and usually got home around 4 in the morning. Too bad. She'd miss the fun. The killer waited nearly an hour. Motley Crue gave way to Metallica, who in turn gave way to Crocus singing Our Love. Midnight Maniac would have been more appropriate, but he didn't complain. At 1 a.m. he reached into the passenger seat. In his lap the murder kit was heavy and warm, as if it were alive and waiting. From its shadowy depths he selected a knife, a roll of duct tape, and a heavy flashlight. Ready, he grabbed the ski mask from the glove compartment and, after a brief inner debate, took the pistol as well. He pulled the ski mask on, and then a pair of black leather gloves. He used to wear latex, but he switched to leather because the killers in giallo movies always seemed to, always wear them, and he liked the killers in giallo movies. He flexed his hands and gritted feverishly at the leathery sound they made. Oh no, Frangella. Knife hands, the serial stabber has escaped from knife prison. Ready, the killer got out of the car and crossed the street. At the foot of the flagstone walk, he paused and swept the street with his gaze. A car passed on a cross street, but otherwise the neighborhood was silent. The light was still on in the living room. At the door, the killer knocked. Part 2. Kevin Turner was hovering on the edge of sleep when the shrill cry of the phone filled the house, startling him. Nighttime phone calls weren't rare at all, but the damn phone still got him every time. Switching on the bedside lamp, he grabbed the phone and hit talk. "Hello?" "Kevin, we got a homicide," Tony McBride said. Tony was his partner and had been for nearly 10 years. "Where?" 252 West 38th. "I'll be there." Kevin hung up the phone and got out of bed, his mind clear and his body tense. He dressed mechanically, pulling on pants, a white shirt and a brown blazer. The house was dark and quiet. He stuck his head into Dylan's room. The boy was face down on the bed, snoring. Probably got shit-faced after the show. Oh, Kevin wished he'd gone. He wished he'd done a lot of things, though. What's one more? Outside, the night was warm and quiet, the air redolent of flowers. Next door, a mass of roses, marigolds, petunias, tulips, and 1,000 other flowers crowded old Mrs. Johnson's tiny Cape Cod. West 38th was 18 blocks south, just west-southwest of the campus of the University of Southern California. Not the best neighborhood in the city, but not the worst either. As he navigated the nighttime surface streets, Kevin wondered what he'd find, as he always did before walking into a homicide. He liked to think he was used to death and depravity, but every cop had that one little thing that got through their armor no matter how long they'd been on the force, or how tough they were. And for Kevin, it was kids. You know how many homicides in the City of Angels involved children? Too goddamn many. Once he walked into a house where a guy hacked his twin daughters up with an axe. 2 little blonde girls, 6, one in a pink dress and the other in overalls. When Kevin walked into their bedroom and found them strewn across the floor in pieces, he turned right back around and walked out. Sometimes he still had nightmares about it. And on those nights, he always got up and checked on his son. 10 minutes later, he pulled onto West 38th. Down the block, several black and whites were parked at the curb, their rack lights dancing blue and red. He pulled in behind one of them and cut the engine. Across the way, uniforms moved in and out of a small bungalow. He saw Tony McBride by the door, talking to a cop. Tall and thin, Tony was dressed in a light brown windbreaker and a pair of jeans, his badge clipped carefully to his belt, opposite his piece. Kevin got out and walked across the street. When Tony saw him, he lifted a hand. "What are we looking at?" Kevin asked. It's a bad one," Tony said, gesturing into the house. 2 victims, female, stab wounds. Their roommate walked in on it. The guy came after her, but she got away." The cop brushed past Kevin, jogged out to his cruiser, and opened the door. "Right, let's have a look." The front door opened onto a tiny hall. On the right was a living room, on the left a dining room. The Vicks were in the living room, and when Kevin saw them, his stomach turned. "Oh, jeez," he muttered. One of the women, a blonde, was lying in a corner on her side. The other, a brunette, was in the middle of the room, her dead eyes gazing skyward. Her dress was hiked up around her hips, and her blood-soaked panties had been stuffed into her mouth. The stomach cavity was open, and from where he stood, Kevin could see her entrails, pink and rope-like. A shiver raced down his spine, and a rush of stomach acid threatened to rise in his throat. Told you," Tony said. Kevin glanced at him and furrowed his brows when he noticed a pockmark in the wall. "Hey, what's that?" he asked, and nodded to it. Tony turned. "Oh yeah, the perp took a shot at our witness." "Where is she?" Outside, the survivor, Kelly Frank, a thin woman with white skin and dark red hair, was huddled in the back of a cruiser, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders despite the warmth of the night. "Kelly?" Kevin asked, approaching. She looked up. "I'm Detective Turner. Can I ask you a few questions?" She gazed up at him, dazed, and then nodded. "Yeah, sure." "Tell me what happened." I got off work early. I came in and I saw him." She trailed off, her throat visibly contracting. It's okay if it... She shook her head. He was raping Linda. She's the brunette. Kelly nodded. He heard me. For a minute I was so scared I couldn't move. Then I saw the gun in his hand and I just ran. Did you get a good look at his face? She shook her head. No, he was wearing a mask. Like a ski mask. Kelly nodded. Where do you work? The newspaper plant on Chestnut. You, deliver papers? She nodded. Kevin removed a notepad from his coat pocket and jotted down what he could. What kind of build did the guy have? Tall, short, skinny? Kelly considered the question. I don't know. Skinny, I guess. Or kind of tall. Kevin nodded. Could you tell if he was black or white? Kelly shook her head again. I think he was white. Kevin nodded again. Do you know anyone who'd want to hurt your friends? Do they have any stalkers, boyfriends, or enemies? Kelly shook her head. Well, Maggie has a boyfriend, but he's a football player, big guy. Linda didn't. She's the teacher's pet type, always studying. Who's Maggie's boyfriend? His name's Chuck. And do you know where he lives? On campus, I think. Hey, I have his number. Can I have it? Kelly gave it to him, and he jotted it down. I'm going to need you to come down to the station at some point. Where can I reach you? She gave him her own number. And, do you have a place to stay tonight? She nodded. Yeah, my boyfriend's coming. Kevin met Tony at the front door. Yeah, said the guy was wearing a ski mask, but she thought he was white, skinny and tall. Well, that narrows the field, Tony said. That's what we have, Kevin replied. I want that slug out of the wall as soon as possible. Have a rape kit done on the brunette. Kelly says she's got the guy on top of her. Tony nodded. And Kevin watched him go back into the house. It was going to be a long day. Chuck Spencer, short, squat, and sporting a dirty blonde crew cut, already knew his girlfriend was dead. Even in a city like LA, news travels fast. Kevin was reluctant to talk to the boy so soon. It was barely 5 in the morning, and already he was tired, but he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until it was done and out of the way. So at 5:30, Kevin drove over to the University of Southern California campus and called on Chuck Spencer. Now, nearly an hour later, they were sitting in the living room of the frat house, Chuck and his buddies on the couch and Kevin in an overstuffed armchair. We swear he was with us, Detective, one of them said. Well, you could check with the club. I'm pretty sure they have video cameras. What time did you leave the club? Chuck considered. 2-ish. Kevin nodded and wrote that down. It was called the Cherry Lounge, a strip club off the beaten path in Skid Row. Kevin knew the place. A lot of bad guys hung out there. Satisfied, he left just as the feeble rays of the morning sun were beginning to cascade over the campus. The tall ancient buildings lining the commons reminded Kevin of prison movies he'd seen as a kid. Michelle took classes here for a while. Well, that was before he went to the academy to be a beat cop. Like Dylan, she loved music, and wound up teaching it at an elementary school. Melancholy sadness rose in his chest as he reached the car. He'd been thinking of Michelle a lot lately. He missed her so bad sometimes it ached, and when he was in bed alone at night, he occasionally hugged her pillow to his chest, her lingering scent comforting him. Standing by the front end, he whipped out his cell and called Tony. He answered on the second ring. Yeah. Get anything? Kevin asked. Maybe, Tony said. He was still back on 38th, going door to door and asking if anyone had seen or heard anything. A few people heard the gunshot, he said, but the only person to actually see the guy jumping into his car and speeding away didn't get the license plate number, but they were fairly certain it was an Oldsmobile. You didn't get to see the color? Tony clucked his tongue. Said it was either light blue or black.
Light blue or black?
Yep.
There's a big difference between light blue and dark blue and black.
Yep, I know.
Kevin sighed. All right. See you in 20.
The bullpen was abuzz with activity. Phones ringing, guys talking, people going back and forth. Jameson, a 15-year veteran, went into the captain's office, looking chastised. At the desk they shared, Tony dropped into his chair.
Anything from the lab?
It's 7:30. Not even 12 hours had passed since the killings. Kevin knew they wouldn't have the lab results before the end of the day at the earliest, but he could hope. Tony shook his head.
No fingerprints either.
Well, that was odd. Their guy seemed thorough, but he was disturbed in the middle of the killing and had to make a quick exit. He should have left something behind.
Gloves?
Kevin asked. Maybe, Tony replied.
Well, I want to see if any of the people we talked to owns an Olds. Bring up the DMV registry.
Tony sighed, leaned over his computer, and started punching buttons. A half an hour later, he sat back defeated.
Nope. Right, try the sex offender registry.
Of all the sex offenders in the Los Angeles area, only one owned an Oldsmobile, and he died the previous week. Tony drew up the DMV registry again and got a list of everyone in LA who owned an Oldsmobile.
That's a lot of names,
Kevin pointed out. Tony matched them against known felons. There were 3 hits. Johnny Cusa, a former triad who did 10 years in jail for manslaughter, owned an Olds, as did Tommy Dem and Walt Parker, both of whom did time in prisons in other states, Dem for forgery and Parker for assault.
Walt Parker?
Kevin asked. Tony nodded.
Yep, might as well.
Parker lived in an apartment building in Westmont overlooking the freeway. When he answered the door, a short balding guy with 3 days' growth on his face. His eyes immediately darted to the badge on Tony's belt.
What do you want?
He asked contemptuously.
I'm Detective McBride, and this is my partner, Detective Turner. We come in?
Whatever. The place was cramped and dingy. Kevin's shoes stuck on the linoleum floor in the kitchen, and he was sure he saw roaches scurrying into the shadows. As succinctly as possible, Kevin told Parker why they were there, and as the realization dawned on him, his face went white.
You don't think I did it, do you?
That's why we're here.
I was here all night. You can ask my daughter. She was here, too.
Where is she now? Tony asked.
Work.
Parker gave them the number to his daughter's place of employment, and she backed him up, just as Kevin thought she would. Parker was short and pudgy. The man Kelly saw last night was tall and thin. Outside, Tony said,
I don't know about you, but I'm bushed. How about we pick this up later?
Kevin checked his watch. It was just after 10. He felt as though he'd been up for 2 days, which, in fact, he had. Now that Tony mentioned it, the weight of his sleeplessness was heavy upon him.
Yeah,
Kevin relented. All right. After dropping Tony off at the station so he could pick up his own car, Kevin drove home, avoiding the freeway. The morning was bright and hot, and by the time he reached his driveway, he was so tired he didn't even think he'd make it into the house. Inside, it was cool and dark. He collapsed onto his bed and fell straight to sleep. His last waking thought, as it usually was of Michelle.
God, I miss you.
In the heat of the day, the killer retreated into his lair, the curtains drawn heavily against the pressing California sun. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. Naked, save for a Nazi armband, he paged lazily through a cracked leather-bound book.
Precious memories,
said the gold script across the front, and the killer smiled knowingly to himself every time he read it. Inside the pages were stiff black cardboard. Carefully taped to each one was a newspaper clipping. The earliest was dated December 15th, 2013.
Man attacked in home. blared the headline. Below that, Studio City man beaten with tire iron. The next was dated December 28, 2013. Man shot, wounded in Encino. The most recent was dated June 1st, 2018. Woman beaten, raped. As the killer flipped through the book, his mind drifted. It started more or less when he was 15. At night, when the world slept, he'd walk the neighborhood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Whenever he passed a house with blue TV glow in the window, he'd stop and wonder what it would be like to kick the door in. How would the owner react? What would they do? What would he do? The subdivision he lived in at the time covered 20 acres north of the city, an endless nervous system of streets, roads, and avenues lined with expensive houses and fat, ancient trees. Sometimes he imagined going into the houses and killing people, clearing entire blocks before sunrise. He could do it, he was certain, as long as none of the houses had security systems, which he knew they did. When he was 17, he finally worked up the courage to break into one. It was a tall 3-story adobe structure with red terracotta roof and palm trees lining a flagstone walk. The guy who owned it traveled a lot and was never home. Deep in the dark night, the killer broke the lock on a back window and climbed in. He wandered the halls and sitting rooms, touching things, moving things, relishing the secret power he now wielded. In the master bedroom, he found a cold woodsman in a nightstand drawer and tucked it into the waistband of his jeans. This belongs to me now, he thought, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. By the time he got home an hour later, he was shaky and weak, and as he drifted to sleep at dawn, he realized he wanted to do it again. 2 weeks later, he did, picking a house at random on one of his nightly walks and watching it for 3 days before jimmying open the sliding glass door and slipping in like a shadow. He went from room to room, rummaging through drawers, dressers, cupboards, and cabinets, touching everything, eating food from the fridge, and leaving a turd in one of the toilets. He found photo albums on a bookshelf in the living room and sat down in the middle of the floor to read them. Vacation photos, Christmas, birthdays, a black family, 2 boys and a girl, mother and father. He took the photo albums with him when he left. They were still in his closet, and he flipped through them from time to time, studying the smiling faces and trying to feel what they felt. He smiled at himself in the mirror in the bathroom, and while it was convincing, it wasn't real. It felt cold and alien on his face. It took him a while to realize that's how it was supposed to feel. Joy, love, happiness, it was all fake. The only joy he ever felt was when he was breaking into houses, and after a while even that started to lose its luster. When he was 19, he figured out a way to make it fun again. He would break into a house with someone in it. The first was a 1-story Spanish-style house at the end of a dead-end street. An old woman lived there alone. Her name was Mrs. Johnson, and she was a teacher at one point. The killer cased the place for 2 weeks, building himself up only to chicken out at the last second. And finally, on a Sunday night, he removed a screen from a window and climbed in, his heart slamming and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He crept through the darkened rooms with a smile on his face, feeling alive for the first time in months. He fingered drapes and couch pillows, rubbed his crotch against a doorframe, and ate an apple from a basket on the counter, leaving the core on the dining room table as a calling card. Apples. Forbidden knowledge. It was in the Bible. Before he left, he went into the old woman's room and stood over her sleeping form, his hard eyes boring into her and his lips arranged in a hateful sneer. Oh, he could kill her, break her neck like snapping a toothpick. Her life rested in his hands, and the godlike feeling made him erect. On his way out, he stole a handful of costume jewelry, not because he wanted it, but because he wanted to remember the rush of power he felt over being in her room, at night, undetected. He did it again 3 nights later, breaking into a house through the back door. Ancient linoleum cracked underfoot. Shadows flared across walls,
and in one of the rooms off the main hall, a TV played. His heart slammed as he went to the closed door, his eyes going to the soft electric glow filling the crack underneath. The TV being on meant that someone might be awake. He could be caught, forced to flight or fight. His nerve endings crackled with energy, and as he pressed his ear to the wood, he began to harden. Seinfeld. They were watching Seinfeld. Yeah, the episode where Jerry's girlfriend has man hands. The killer flashed a wide, toothy grin. Yeah, he liked that one. Maybe he should go in and watch it with his new friend. If he or she was awake, they could laugh along with the audience, and if he or she wasn't, the killer could sit on the edge of the bed and risk them seeing him. Yeah, that sounded fun. Instead of doing that, though, he went into the kitchen and made himself a sandwich. He leaned against the counter as he ate, mentally daring one of the occupants to come out and challenge him. None of them did, however, and before he left, he took their DVD player away. 2 blocks south, he smashed it against the street and kicked the shattered pieces along the pavement, hoping someone ran over it come morning and wound up with a flat. Sneaking into occupied houses became a twice-weekly ritual for him, then a thrice-weekly ritual as the warm glow it provided began to diminish. When he was entirely bored of it, he started to carry the Colt and a tire iron. He itched to use it, prayed that someone would catch him, but no one did. And then he grew bolder. One night he went into someone's bedroom and nudged them awake, a man with a bald pate and a pug nose. He muttered and snorted, like a pig. Disgust came over the killer, and before he knew what he was doing, he was raising the iron above his head, and then bringing it down. The end hit the man's head with a hollow thunk, and he jerked as though he'd been shot. The killer did this twice more before leaving him for dead. He read in the next day's paper that he'd survived. Oh, pity. He went further afield the next time, driving to Encino. Inside a lower middle-class bungalow with peeling paint, he was caught. A man walked out of a bedroom while the killer was looking through a living room bookshelf. "Hey!" Instinct took over. He whipped out the Colt, aimed, and pulled the trigger, the round catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. Panicking, he ran, and for a long time he was hesitant to do it again, but the call was just too great. No one knew it, but this city belonged to him. He walked the streets at night like a demon, wielding such unimaginable power that mortal men would quake before him, if only they imagined. Presently, the 12 o'clock news came on, and the killer popped up. When the anchor started talking about what he'd done the night before, his stomach dropped. Double murder, they said. Violent home invasion, they said. He closed the book and set it aside. Moving deliberately, cat-like, he got closer to the TV until he was sitting on the edge of the bed, leaning forward, his hands clasped on his knees. Wow. He was somebody now. He grinned like a shark. Just wait until tonight, Mr. Anchorman. Just wait until tonight. Part 3. Kevin Turner came slowly and groggily awake in a spill of weak afternoon light. He was lying on his stomach, the side of his face buried in the pillow and his knees digging into the mattress, elevating him slightly. Blinking the sleep from his eyes, he stared at the face of the digital alarm clock until the numbers made sense. 5:45 p.m. Sighing, he rolled over, kicked his legs over the edge and sat up, his head spinning. He raked one hand through his white hair and rubbed the heel of his palm against his aching temple. It had happened again. The dream. Hot tears welled in his eyes and he blinked them back. He saw Michelle on the backs of his eyelids, her face sunken, skin wan, eyes muddled grey with sickness and coming death. As always, he was standing by her bedside, her hand in his, just as he had in real life. Only in the dream she wasn't dying.
She'd already died but come back and was dying again. Her touch was cold, dry, that of a corpse. When she spoke the words, "I love you, Kevin," her voice was a hissing rattle. He never dreamed of her any other way. They had nearly 25 happy years together, so many precious memories, so many laughs and tender kisses. But he only ever dreamed of her sick and dying. With a sigh, he got to his feet and shuffled into the master bathroom on socked feet, snapping on the light and peeling out of his wife-beater. Next came his pants, underwear and socks. Naked now, he turned the water as hot as he could and got into the shower, where he let the water cascade over his tense, tired body. Not for the first time, he considered retirement. He was just over 10 years from his pension, something that every homicide detective works toward. But he didn't know if it was worth it anymore. The stress, the hours, the not being there for his son. He let that thought trail off and sought refuge in the only thing he had to hide himself behind. Work. The ballistics should be back by now, and maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten lucky with a witness. When he was done, he got out, toweled off, and then went into his room. He took underwear and a pair of grey pants from the dresser and pulled them on, then a white button-up. He shrugged into his shoulder rig, clipped his badge to his belt, and slipped into a grey sports coat. After putting on socks and shoes, he went into the kitchen and found Dylan leaning against the counter while waiting for something in the microwave, his arms crossed over his chest and his head bowed. He looked up when Kevin entered and smirked. "Hey, look who's up." "Barely," Kevin said, going to the fridge. He opened it and grabbed a can of Coke. "Yeah, it was an early day." "Yeah, I figured," Dylan said. "You were gone when I got up. So somebody do something wrong?" Kevin chuckled and took a long, grateful drink, the liquid cold against his dry throat. "Well, 3 somebodies," he said. Dylan's brow furrowed in confusion. 3 people were done wrong, or 3 people did somebody wrong. Triple murder. Dylan winced. Before Michelle had died, Kevin discussed his cases with her. He had to. You can't keep all of that bottled up inside of you. If you try, it'll eventually come out and you'll end up sticking your service weapon in your mouth. Well, now that she was gone, it was Dylan. The poor kid bore the brunt of LA's worst on a daily basis. But he did it without complaint, and even gave thoughtful advice where he could, just as his mother had done. Kevin took another drink. 3 women. His mind flashed back to the crime scene, and a rush of hatred went through him. One of them raped. "Ah, Jesus," Dylan breathed, and then shuddered. "Man, I don't know how you do it. I couldn't take dealing with that shit." Well, Kevin knew. Dylan was as sensitive as his mother. Oh, he put on a tough facade like every other teenage boy to ever live, but he was a baby when it came to things like blood and death. Sometimes he reminded Kevin so much of Michelle that his chest ached anew with loss, like an old break foretelling the coming rain. "Well, someone has to," Kevin said. He finished his soda and dropped the empty into the trash. "I'll try to be home early tonight," he said, and clasped Dylan's arm. Dylan smiled. "All right." As Kevin drove to the station, he tried to pinpoint just exactly what he'd seen in his son's eyes as he spoke that final word. He was walking into the bullpen when it hit him. Doubt. "I'm not holding my breath," that look said. "Been there, done that." He started to feel sorry for himself, but didn't have the time. Tony was already at the desk, and when he saw Kevin come in, he waved him over. "Ah, Mr. Sleepyhead," Tony said as he walked up. "You missed a lot." Kevin's heart jagged. "What?" he asked. Tony snatched a paper off the desk and held it up so he could read it. "Ballistics are back. The bullet we dug out of the wall came from the same gun used to kill Ray Mancini." Kevin's brow shot up. "The same gun?" "Yes, sir," Tony said. "Whoever did him did the girls on 38th. He picked an envelope up from the desk and handed it to Kevin. "Oh, plus, you got mail, buddy." Kevin took it hesitantly, looking from Tony to it with suspicion. The writing on the front was blocky and red. Detective Kevin Turner, it said. The return address was 123 Fake Street, Helltown, USA, 666-6666. He looked at Tony, and the same thought passed between them. This can't be good. Swallowing, Kevin ripped open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As he read it, his heart dropped. "What?" Tony asked. Kevin read it aloud. "Dear Kevin Turner, I heard it through the grapevine that you're dealing with what I did last night. Same old song and dance, my friend. But you know what? Hell ain't a bad place to be. Not when you've gone shooting like I have. Oh, speaking of shooting, I shot that Mancini guy. Put 3 in his tummy. Didn't like it, though. Guns are too impersonal. I like to get up close, like I did last night. You could say it was love at first feel. Well, I plan to kill more, many more. It ain't no fun waiting around to be a millionaire, and I'm done waiting for the power age. By the end of the summer, the whole world will know my name. Come along for the ride? Well, you'll be famous too. We'll all be famous. See you on the other side. It's time to ride on. And P.S. If you want to find out who I am, do your homework. Love, the Night Prowler." Though Tony was fairly dark, his face was white now. Kevin scanned the note again, his guts tightening with every pass until he felt like his stomach was going to squeeze out of his mouth. "Oh, you know what this means, don't you?" Kevin asked. Tony nodded. "Oh, yeah," he said. They were dealing with a serial killer. After meeting with Captain Reynolds, Kevin called Dylan. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" "Hey, it's me," Kevin said. He was standing in the hallway. Cops were moving around him, some speaking, but many silent. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Kevin licked his lips. "Look, something came up. Something big. I won't be home for a while." When a case blew up the way this one had, Kevin slept in one of the conference rooms off the hall he was standing in. He didn't know if he'd do that tonight. He wasn't planning on it. But he knew like hell he wouldn't be home before midnight at the earliest. He felt a twinge of shame when he told his son this. "All right," Dylan said. "I'm out with Sean and Lyra anyway. I probably won't be home until midnight either." Well, Sean was the lead singer of Dylan's band, and Lyra was Dylan's girlfriend. Though she wasn't officially their manager, she knew people, thanks to her rich daddy. And in fact, it was her who booked last night's show. "All right, then. I'll call you later." "Okay," Dylan said. "I love you," Kevin said, and he meant it. "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." Kevin lingered for a moment, not wanting to hang up, but sat the phone back on the cradle. Was it his guilty conscience, or had there been a hint of disappointment in Dylan's voice? He decided there hadn't. Dylan was almost a man now, and he understood how things were. At least Kevin told himself that. It was easier on his heart to think Dylan understood the way his mother had. Sighing, Kevin got up and went into the day room. Patrolman Peter Nasher, whom Kevin had known for years, sat with a rookie at one of the tables, showing the kids something on his phone. "Hey, Kevin," Nasher said. "Come check this out." Kevin poured a measure of coffee into a styrofoam cup and walked up to Nasher, bending to see over his shoulder. "Yeah, what's up?" Kevin asked. Nasher held the phone up so Kevin could see better. "I went to a concert last night." A big, shit-eating grin spread across his thin lips. He looked like a boy who wanted praise for doing something not especially praiseworthy. Kevin nodded. "Nice. Who was it?" "AC/DC, Nasher said. Nasher, a year or two older than Kevin, was one of those guys who refused to settle down and wears it like a badge of honor. He lived alone in a studio apartment on the sea and spent his money on fun things: women, bars, vacations to Mexico, and concerts. He was an overgrown teenager and was happy that way. Well, to each his own, Kevin figured. Well, at one time, he and Peter had been close. They came through the academy together and worked side by side on the street. Well, Kevin couldn't say that they were best friends, but they were friends nevertheless. And then something came between them. A promotion. It was always women or a promotion. Those two things had ruined more friendships over the years than anything else. Kevin and Peter both wanted on homicide, and they both went for the same opening. Kevin got the promotion, and Peter didn't. And that was all there was to it. There was no blowout, no cinematic rants that, it should have been me. And they no longer worked together, and though Peter was always amicable when they met, Kevin could sense his jealousy. He was always there, bubbling just beneath the surface, visible but only as a brief shadow. Well, that was a long time ago, and Peter had gotten over it by now. Their friendship, however, had never recovered. Might be the last tour, Asher said. Well, AC/DC was a little before Kevin's time, and because of that, they were a mystery to him. You might recognize a few of their songs if you heard them on the radio, but he knew nothing else about them. Well, maybe, Kevin said. Hey, you working tonight? Asher shook his head. I got vacation time. I'm leaving tonight. You have some fun for me, huh? Asher grinned. Oh, I will. I'll have a lot of fun. Back in the bullpen, Kevin sat at his desk and took a long, hot sip as he went over the letter again. Do your homework, the killer had said. What does this clown think police work is? It's all homework. Do your homework. First of all, how did the killer know that he, Kevin Turner, was the lead investigator on this case? The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in general. It was directed at him. Lucky guess? Well, maybe, but he didn't really believe that. Did he know the killer? Well, he wanted to laugh out loud at how stupid that was. Of all the people he knew, none of them could do that. No, he doubted he knew the killer, but the killer knew him. Kevin finished his coffee and went back to poring over the note. Let me guess, Lyra said when Dylan hung up the phone. Your dad's working late again? They were sitting in the back of Sean's car, cruising aimlessly through the more fashionable parts of L.A., near Beverly Hills, which were the only places that were still safe to aimlessly drive. Lyra's expression was one of concern, and Dylan almost hated her for it. Yeah, he finally said, the words tasting bitter on his lips. He tried to keep the resentment from his voice, but he didn't do a very good job of it. Yeah, what's new, though? A soft frown touched Lyra's lips. Well, you know he loves you, right? He let out a humorous laugh. Do I? You know, he's always doing this. His fucking job's more important than anything else. It was more important when Mom was alive, and it's more important now. He roiled with anger and forced himself to take a deep breath. Lyra rested her head on his shoulder, her way of trying to comfort him, and once again, because of Dad, he felt 2 inches tall. God, he keeps missing important shit, Dylan said. He sounded burned out. He felt burned out. Let's say something to him, Lyra suggested. Dylan sighed. We couldn't. I don't want to make him feel bad, he said. I know he doesn't mean to do it. He's just got a lot going on, and he doesn't need me hurting his feelings. Yeah, but he hurts yours, Lyra pointed out. Yeah, he did. In the front seat, Sean said, wait until he's done and take him out for a date night. Works for my parents. Dylan laughed. Are you paying? Yeah, I'll slip you a few bucks, Sean said. For the next half hour, Dylan tried to rescue his mood, but it stayed in the toilet, and he eventually asked Sean to take him home. Sean dropped him at the foot of the driveway, and Dylan waved as he and Lyra drove off. He turned to face the house and sighed deeply. Alone again, he thought. Naturally. The killer drove aimlessly north on the freeway as afternoon gave way to evening, lost in the constant flow of Los Angeles traffic. From downtown he headed west, through Beverly Hills, with its manicured gardens and fashionable shops. He watched the pretty girls walking along the sidewalk, their skirts short and their sunglasses big, and briefly considered kidnapping one of them. If he was lucky, he'd get the daughter of a famous actor. Oh, that'd make the world sit up and take notice. The only thing that stopped him was the realization that the law would come down hard on him. You take a black prostitute and no one cares. But you take a Kardashian and they'll send the fucking military after you. Like that one song said, "Not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time." And being run down by Private Pyle and his butt buddy Sergeant Shitsucker before he could finish his work didn't sound like a good time at all. Leaving downtown to his own devices, nothing he could do there that politicians and activists weren't doing better. He drove south towards Santa Monica. Purple dusk lay over the city now, and by the time he reached Santa Monica Boulevard, stars twinkled in the sky. For a long time he sat in a parking lot overlooking the Pacific, smoking and listening to the radio. The surf had been gnarly that day, bro, and a group of surfers sat around a bonfire laughing and drinking beer, enjoying the night. The killer remembered a scene from The Lost Boys, where a similar group of beer drinkers fell victim to a bunch of rabid vampires, and he smiled. He briefly considered getting out of the car, walking over and blasting all of them, but thought better of it. Herb Mullin had done something similar in 1973, blasting a bunch of boys on a camping trip. But he did that in the mountains of North San Fran, not in the middle of the fucking city. Someone would see him, the killer realized, and he'd be caught. With a sad sigh then, he put the car in drive and drove east, eventually joining the southward flow of traffic on the San Diego freeway. At Culver City he got off and parked across from a Shell station at the foot of the off-ramp. As he waited, he scanned the radio news. Earlier he heard something about the 2 bitches he'd killed, but that was it. Nothing since. Nothing about them, nothing about the letter. Nothing at all. Rage swept through him. He did not like to be ignored. God, what do you have to do in this day and age? Blow up a daycare center? We guess he'd have to make tonight's outing extra gruesome. At midnight, the killer drove further away from the highway. At a cul-de-sac lined with 2-story homes, he parked under a streetlight and killed the engine. On Sirius XM Hair Nation, Accept was blistering through balls to the wall. The killer tapped the wheel to the beat as he surveyed the houses around him. He hadn't staked these out, but that was okay. The not knowing was half the fun. Finally, he decided on the only 1-story house on the block, a withered little thing nearly hidden between 2 of its larger neighbors. He took his kill kit from the passenger side footwell and took out the mask, the knife, a length of rope, a screwdriver, and the flashlight. The pistol was already in his pocket. At 1:58 a.m., he got out of the car and walked across the street. A narrow alleyway ran between the little house and its western neighbor. A green garden hose lay coiled in the dust, next to a battered red radio flyer wagon. The backyard was full of shadows. Standing there, the neighbors on either side could see him if they were awake. Trembling with excitement, he tried the back door. It was locked, but he had the screwdriver. After jimmying the door open, he slipped into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. The house was dark and silent, save for the distant sound of snoring. Moving as silently as possible, the killer searched the house, but save for the snoring fox, it was empty. Perfect. The master bedroom door was slightly ajar. He eased it open and slipped in. 2 forms lay under the covers. The killer crept to the larger one and squinted down. A man, chubby, late 30s, stupid goatee. Sudden hatred gripped the killer's heart, and he raised the flashlight over his head. Sensing something, the man stirred and his eyes fluttered open. The killer brought the flashlight down square on the man's face. He gasped and jerked. The killer struck him again, harder this time, bringing the flashlight down with such force that the man's nose broke in a burst of blood. On the other side of the bed, the woman sat up. "What?" she started, then, seeing him, screamed and tumbled out of bed. "Bitch." The killer scrambled across the mattress and over the man, grabbing a handful of her hair before she could flee. She cried out, but he clamped a hand over her mouth and dragged her back, over her husband's trembling body. On the floor, over her,
The killer raised his fist and smashed her in the face. Once, twice, 3 times. He was panting now, losing control. "Oh, you fuck," he growled, grabbing her by the throat and squeezing. "You fucker." She thrashed and tried to scream, but could only gurgle deep in her throat. "Bitch, bitch, bitch," the killer chanted, his fingernails digging deep into the soft flesh of her throat. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she went limp. Panting even harder now, the killer got to his feet and kicked her in the leg. Behind him, the husband moaned. The killer had almost forgotten him. When he turned, the man was starting to stir. The flashlight was on the floor where he dropped it. He grabbed it and hit the son of a bitch again and again. When he was as limp as his wife, the killer rolled him onto his stomach and straddled his back. He slipped the flashlight lengthways across his throat and pulled back with both hands. "Get along, little doggy." When he was sure the fat fuck was dead, he got up and went back to the woman. She was unconscious but alive, blood trickling from her nose and her busted lips. Using the knife, he cut her thin nightgown off and threw it aside. She was a beefy woman. Her breasts were large and pink, and her rank passage was hidden by a tangle of dark curly hair. Panting, the killer fumbled at his belt. When he was free, he thrust deep into her. Her eyes opened, and she tried to scream, but he had the knife and cut her throat before she could. The moment her spirit left her, he came, shooting hot ribbons deep into her belly. For a while he simply lay on the floor next to her, breathing deeply of the scent of blood and sex. After nearly half an hour he got up and went into the bathroom abutting the room. His hands were bloody and splatters marred his face and hair. He stripped, climbed into the shower, and let the hot water sluice over his body. When he was done, he got out, dressed, and smashed the mirror on the way out. In the bedroom, he did a quick search and found a jewelry box on the dresser. He took a large tangle of necklaces out and stuffed them into his pockets. Before leaving, he grabbed the flashlight and the knife. He tried to turn the flashlight on, but it was dead. In the kitchen, he stopped at the fridge. Inside, he found a Coca-Cola. He grabbed it, popped it open, and drank deeply, savoring the sweet, cold liquid. And when he was done, he crumpled the can and tossed it over his shoulder. At the back door, he stopped. Oops. Almost forgot something. In the bedroom, he removed a red marker from his pocket and wrote a message on the far wall, so that whoever entered couldn't help but see it. Then he left, disappearing into the night like a bad dream. Part 4. On the bright morning of June 29th, after a sleepless night, Kevin Turner parked across from the house on N Street and killed the engine. Several squad cars stood at the curb, and about a dozen cops were moving this way and that. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the furnace blast breeze. "I don't even want to go in there," Tony said. "Neither do I," Kevin said, and got out. Sergeant Win Jin Liu, a short Chinese man, nodded as they approached. "It's a slaughterhouse in there," he warned. Kevin's stomach churned. The house was tastefully appointed, knickknacks and pictures peppering the living room. Though lower class, the home was neat and tidy, which is why the Coke can on the kitchen floor struck Kevin as weird. He pointed it out. Liu nodded. "Right, we got it." When Kevin stepped into the master bedroom, his stomach turned, and he felt his knees going weak. First thing he noticed was the writing on the wall directly across from the door. In red, July 27, 1979. "Hi, Kevin." And a drawing of a giant spurting penis. As soon as Kevin saw his own name, his stomach dropped to his feet. Tony glanced at him, a brief flash of concern on his face, and then forced a friendly smile. "God, he really likes you." Kevin tried to smile back but couldn't. In the bedroom,
was the main cause. The woman lay on the floor, nude, her legs spread wide open. The man was in bed, lying on his stomach. From here, Kevin could see his head had been caved open. Blood, bits of skull, and chunks of brain matter were splashed across the bed, the nightstand, and the blinds covering the window next to the bed. "Jesus Christ," Kevin muttered. Liu nodded. "Whoever did this is one sick puppy." Kevin forced himself further into the room. The woman's throat was cut. Clots of dark blood splattered her doughy flesh. "Oh, we gotta stop him," Kevin muttered, speaking before he even knew he intended to. "We gotta stop him." "Well, we gotta find him first," Liu pointed out. And that was easier said than done. Once they had everything they needed, Kevin and Tony left. Kevin was grateful to be out of there. After the relative dimness of the bedroom, the day was even hotter and brighter than before. Kevin slipped on a pair of sunglasses and followed Tony to the car. A group of worried neighbors stood by a length of yellow crime scene tape and talked among themselves. Kevin and Tony went over to question them, but none of them knew anything. A half hour after walking out of the slaughterhouse, Kevin and Tony left, Tony driving and Kevin staring out the open window. His eyes were grainy and his face coated in sweat. The furnace breeze blowing through the window felt good. "Hey, I don't get it," Kevin said. "What?" Tony asked. "Why me?" Kevin asked. Ever since he'd seen his name on that wall, it had been eating away at his mind. He remembered Dylan, and his stomach clutched so hard that he almost choked. "And what if he comes after my kid?" Tony shook his head. "Nah, not gonna happen. He's just messing with you. Wants you off your guard. I don't know who this guy is, but he's not your average Ted Bundy. He's movie level." Kevin stared out of the window and nervously chewed his thumbnail. "Who is he? How did he know I was on the case? Why did he address that letter to me?" And for that, Tony had no answer. Maybe he's someone you put away." Yeah, that made sense. You put someone in jail, and instead of taking it on the chin, they wanted revenge. They were clearly fucked in the head and were going to do this anyway, but they were bringing him into it. Who could it be, though? They had to know that he was assigned to the case. At the very least, they had to know he was a senior investigator and might get assigned to it. Well, that could be anyone. He glanced at Tony. Even him. By the time they arrived back at the station, the news had broken. 4 people dead in 2 days, brutally murdered in their own homes after midnight. In his sun-washed office, Captain Reynolds, a tall, lanky man, sighed and threw his head back. "I've been getting calls all morning," he said. "TV, newspapers, goddamn media will turn this guy into the bogeyman by the end of the day." And with fear came pressure. Kevin knew that well enough. When a serial killer was running around hacking people up, everybody wanted him caught, and if the police didn't pull an instantaneous capture out of their asses, people would be mad. The mayor would be on their case, because if people got mad and stayed mad, her ass was out of a job. The commissioner would be mad, the people of LA would be mad, and it was like fighting a 2-front war. "Any evidence?" Captain Reynolds asked. "A footprint in the side yard," Tony said. "Under the window. That's pretty much it. Most of the surfaces were clean as a whistle. Not even the Vic's prints." This guy is tidy," Captain Reynolds said. "I hate tidy." He looked at Kevin and furrowed his brow. Usually Kevin was the one who gave the status reports. All during their meeting, however, he'd been staring steadily into space and biting his nails. "Hey, what's on your mind?" Kevin exhaled through his nose. "I'm scared," he imagined himself saying. "Scared shitless." Out loud, however, he said, "He knows me. Whoever this guy is, he knows me." You think he's inside the department?" Reynolds asked. Kevin swallowed. "Hope not." "Who could he be then? Past arrest?" "Maybe," Kevin said. He choked, not wanting to admit his own fear. "I'm worried about my son." Captain Reynolds nodded his understanding. I'll have a man posted outside your house round the clock until we catch this guy. In the meantime, check that date he left against every known fella in the city. Maybe it's an arrest date, birth date, something. Means nothing to you, right?"
Kevin shook his head.
"All right, then. I'm holding a press conference at 3 this afternoon. I'd like to have some information by then. Don't expect it, but it would be nice."
"Already?" Kevin asked. Usually Reynolds held off on presses.
The mayor's worried she'll lose her election. Crime's up, druggies are dropping everywhere, stores are being cleaned out, and now a serial killer. She won't address the other stuff, but she can sure as shit address this."
Bitterness crept into his voice. The marriage between the department and city leadership had always been strained, but in today's climate, it had all but broken out into open warfare. An hour later, while searching for the meaning of July 27th, 1979, Kevin was startled by Tony.
"Hey, we got a lead," he said.
"What's that?"
"Guy at a Shell station by the freeway a mile from the crime scene said he saw a strange car parked across the street. There 2.5 hours last night."
"What kind of car?" Kevin asked, his heart swelling.
"Light blue Oldsmobile Cutlass."
They arrived at the station less than an hour later. The sun lay across the city like a bar of fire, and the humid breeze blowing in from the sea did little to alleviate the heat. Smog hung overhead, and seeing the buildings downtown through the haze, Kevin could almost believe that he was in a horror movie. The guy who spotted the Oldsmobile was a mechanic at the auto shop attached to the gas station, a short fat man with curly black hair and glasses. He was waiting outside when they arrived, his arms folded over his ample bosom. He was wearing a pair of light grey overalls stained black with grease, motor oil, and 1,000 other less nameable things. When Kevin shook his hand, it was warm and slimy, and he had to fight the urge to wipe it on his pants leg. His name was Charlie Ward. He'd been working here since 2005 and knew the area like the back of his hand.
"Well, as you can see, it's mainly businesses."
The little slice of Culver City, cast in the shadow of the raised San Diego freeway, was crammed with auto shops, factories, and garages. The buildings here were faded brick, the walls and metal roll-top doors splashed with graffiti.
"Things shut down early.
You don't have many people hanging around. About 10, 11 last night, noticed this car parked at the curb across the street. I could see somebody sitting in it. He never moved. Never got out or anything. I thought maybe he was waiting for somebody, but after a while, I thought maybe he was bad news, I was about to call the cops when he started the car and drove off." "Which way was he going?" Kevin asked.
"What, that way?"
Ward replied, gesturing vaguely east. Toward the crime scene.
You didn't happen to catch the plate number, did you?" Tony asked.
Ward shook his head.
"No, I'm sorry."
"Well, did you get a good look at the guy?" Ward shrugged one shoulder. "Saw him as he drove off. Streetlight sort of fell on him, and I kind of saw him."
"Oh, white? Black?" Tony asked.
"Oh, white," Ward said. "Yeah, it was definitely white. Maybe light-skinned Hispanic." "Did you see any features?" Kevin asked. Ward shook his head.
"Well, he had hair.
Eyes. I think his hair was either brown or pale red, but can't really say." Kevin pursed his lips in bitter disappointment and jotted that down. He snapped the notebook closed. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Ward. You've been a great help."
"No problem,"
Ward said. "I hope you catch the guy. Heard he cut someone's head off and punted it into the traffic. God, sick motherfucker." Oh, the legends were already beginning. Back in the car, Kevin said, "If we could only get those plate numbers." Tony nodded.
"Well, we know what he drives now."
"Yeah, we already knew, but it's just confirmed now." Tony shrugged.
"Yeah, better than nothing."
"Yeah," Kevin thought, and started to chew his nail again. Better than nothing. The killer spent the better part of the day holed up in his lair, stroking the woodsman, letting his mind wander back over the previous night. The power and dominance that surged through him as he stood over the bodies of his victims. After leaving,
he aimlessly drove the back streets of Los Angeles, heaped with garbage, grime, and human refuse. L.A. was two cities in one, he thought. All glitz and glam in Hollywood and Beverly Hills, and stark urban decay in Compton, Watts, and Skid Row. Very few people actually saw the dark underbelly, and if they did, it was too late. You can check out any time you like, Padre, but you can never leave. Still keyed up from the kill, he briefly considered gunning down a few hobos, but settled on buying a prostitute, a girl named Maria he'd fucked in the past. Finally, as dawn crested, he drove north toward home, getting off the freeway just as the feeble light of day began its inexorable march across the city. After 3 hours of sleep, he woke and spent the morning scanning the news. Presently, he was waiting for the press conference to begin, his official coming-out party. When it started, he set aside the woodsman, which he'd been holding absent-mindedly, and moved closer to the TV. Kevin wasn't around for the press conference, but he and Tony saw it on the TV mounted to the wall above the bar at Louis on Palms Boulevard. Everybody in the place craned their neck when it came on. Someone at the bar implored the bartender to turn it up. The captain, dressed in full uniform, came to the podium and nodded politely to the reporters. Kevin didn't hear exactly what he said, but he got the gist. A serial killer was loose in the city, and so far he'd been linked to 5 murders. He was considered armed and dangerous. Police were working around the clock to find him. "I will also be appointing a task force." Hope we're on it," Tony said, absent-mindedly shoving a fry into his mouth. Kevin's own food sat largely untouched before him. Kevin's stomach knotted. For the first time in his career, he hoped that the hot case went to someone else, or anyone else. This was too personal for him, too dangerous. No one had ever taunted him this way before. No one had ever scared him like this. He'd been calling and texting with Dylan all day like a mother hen and was probably driving him crazy. Kevin didn't tell him specifics because he didn't want to scare him, but he wanted him to know that he had to be on his guard. 2 hours later, Captain Reynolds called them into his office. Yes, they would be on the task force. Their sole purpose was to catch the Night Prowler, and they'd better do it as quickly as they could. A couple more nights like this, and LA's gonna blow. People were already scared. More cops than usual were on the streets. No one felt safe. Kevin couldn't say he blamed them. At this point, all we can do is hope he slips up, Reynolds said with a sigh. Kevin hated to agree with him, but had no choice. By 10 o'clock, Tony had finished going through the registry of known felons. July 27th, 1979 meant absolutely nothing. I don't know, he said, leaning back in his chair, defeated. Maybe it's the date of his first kill. We could check missing persons records. Kevin sighed. Yeah, maybe. Earlier, Kevin had called his mother for the first time in 6 months. She sounded surprised to hear from him, and a knife blade of guilt sliced through him. This was the year he won both Father of the Year and Son of the Year. Hey, how's it going? She asked. It's good to hear from you. They talked for a little bit, and Kevin finally came to the point. Hey, does the date July 27th, 1979 mean anything to you? Well, for a long time, Mom was quiet, and a steely band of suspense closed around Kevin's chest, squeezing the air gradually from his lungs until they were deflated like 2 sad balloons. Oh, I don't think so, she said at last. Kevin's shoulders sagged, and then they perked up again. Actually, I'm not sure if it was that day or not. What? Kevin spat. I was dating a man before I met your father, and we broke up in July of 79. Kevin's heart started to race. Who? His name was Dave Connor. Wasn't a very nice man. Alarm bells clanged in Kevin's head. How? His mom hesitated. It just wasn't. Her tight tone closed the matter. She wouldn't talk any more about Dave Connor. Why? She asked.
He, when was he born?
Kevin,
When was he born?
Mom sighed and thought for a minute. April 8th, I think. Forget the year. He's a few years older than me.
And what happened to him?
I don't know, Mom said, sounding upset. Hey, what is this all about?
Oh, nothing. I gotta go. Love you.
He hung up the phone and hurried back to his desk. If July 27th, 1979 was related to him somehow, he knew it had to be through one of his parents. He wasn't even alive in July 79. Kevin looked Dave Connor up in the National Crime Database and found his rap sheet. He'd been in and out of jail since he was 14. Armed robbery, grand theft auto, assault, and rape.
He wasn't a very nice man, Mum had said.
Did Dave Connor... Forcing that thought out of his mind, Kevin checked with the owner of Connor's last known address. The old man had left the previous year and no one knew where he was. Kevin swallowed. Jilted ex-lover tracks down son of former flame and terrorizes him. It sounded crazy, but crazier things had happened. Since then, Kevin had been on edge, and every time he saw a grey head, his heart jumped into his throat and his fight-or-flight response kicked in.
Detective Turner?
Kevin and Tony both looked up. Sergeant Liu was standing behind him, his arms behind his back, seeming to have materialized out of nothing. He was dressed in a blue shirt and black pants, his gun belt hanging heavy on his tiny waist.
I have someone who wants to talk to you.
Who? Follow me. Liu led them into a conference room off the main hall. A tall Hispanic woman with long dark hair and big brown eyes was seated at the head of the table. She was wearing a tight red dress and a leopard skin coat. Bracelets hung from her wrists. Judging by the lipstick, eyeshadow, and rouge, she was a working girl. "Detectives," Liu said. "This is Maria Salazar. She thinks she knows who the Night Prowler is." The woman looked up at Kevin and nodded.
At least, he said he was.
Heart beginning to race again, Kevin nodded to Liu.
Yeah, thanks.
Liu smiled and left the room, softly closing the door behind him.
Maria, I'm Detective Turner, and this is Detective McBride, Kevin said.
Tony shook her hand first, then sank into the chair on her right. Kevin was next. When he was done, he sat on her left.
Right, what do you want to tell us?
The woman sighed, rolled her neck, and seemed to steel herself for the story. "Well, I'm a hooker," she said, to the point. "I have sex with guys for money. Some guys nut and go and you never see them again. Some guys like you and keep coming back." Kevin nodded, slightly taken aback by her candor.
All right.
This guy keeps coming back. Real weirdo. Creepy eyes. Weird smile. Yeah, he likes it kinky. "How kinky?" Tony asked. "He wears a ski mask when we do it," Maria said, looking at him. "Some girls do whatever it takes to make a customer happy. But, well, I draw the line at handcuffs and stuff. Every time this guy comes around, he tries to get me to let him cuff my hands behind my back. And when he gets going, he's real aggressive about it, you know."
What's his name?
Kevin asked. "He calls himself Bon, but don't think that's his real name."
Bon?
She nodded. "Yeah, like Bon. Kevin wrote that down. "Well, a lot of guys like to get freaky," Tony said, leaning forward. "What makes you think he's the Night Prowler?"
Easy, Kevin thought,
recognizing that Tony was subtly putting her on the defensive. Don't push her too hard. "Well, he told me," Maria said.
He did?
Kevin asked. She nodded. "Last night he picked me up, real late. Told me he killed a man and a woman in Culver City." Kevin's ears perked.
What does he drive?
He asked. Shitty Oldsmobile." Tony and Kevin looked at each other.
Have you ever seen his face? Kevin asked. Is he young? Old?
"Oh, I've seen it," Maria said confidently. Kevin looked at Tony. Get a sketch artist, now. An hour later, they had a quick black and white portrait of Bond. I never got a real good look at him, Maria had said. He always just picks me up, and it's dark, you know. When they were done, Kevin stared at the blurry face of the man, the monster, who had been tormenting Kevin's every waking thought since that morning. It was a plain face, framed by scraggly hair, big Coke bottle glasses perched on a too thick nose. His chin was lumpy and misshapen. Something about the killer's features struck Kevin as, well, unnatural. Either way, it wasn't Dave Connor. Wherever the rapist was, he wasn't the Night Prowler. Still, there was something oddly familiar about that face. He'd seen it before. He didn't know how or where, but he was certain that he and the killer had met before. "Recognize him?" Tony asked. Kevin racked his brain, trying to remember where, when, and how he'd seen this face before, but nothing came. Had he arrested him before? Had he seen him on the street, on TV? No, he couldn't remember, so it must not have meant much at the time. "I think so," Kevin finally said. "Really?" Tony asked. Kevin hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I think I might, but look at his nose and chin." Taking the sketch, Tony examined it closely. "Why, you think they're fake?" Kevin opened his mouth and then closed it again. That wasn't what he was thinking, but now that Tony mentioned it, yeah, they did look fake. "Prosthetics," Tony supplied. "Like they use in the movies?" Maybe, Kevin said. "You know who he looks like?" Tony asked. "Who?" "David Koresh." Who the hell was... Suddenly Kevin remembered, and his spirits crashed. Koresh was that guy in Waco, the one who thought he was Jesus or something. For a second there, he thought Tony recognized him too. "So we're looking for a ghost now," he said dryly. "Might as well be," Tony replied. "Comes and goes like one." For the rest of the day, Kevin dug deep into the recesses of his memory to come up with how he knew that face. Sitting at his and Tony's desk, he stared at the sketch, willing something to come. At one point, a name did come, but he instantly rejected it. No, it didn't look like him. Well, it looked like... He didn't know, damn it, and it was really starting to bug him. Sitting in his chair, he pinched the bridge of his nose and took a deep breath, which he then let out in a long exhalation. Before letting Maria go, he asked her to pass a copy of the sketch out to her friends. By 2 a.m, several dozen copies had been printed and distributed to offices on the street. Copies were also sent to every newspaper in the city. Well, that wasn't Kevin's call, it was the captain's, and it was a pretty stupid one if you asked him. If they let the killer know that they had his face, they'd blow their only advantage. Well, the captain was feeling the heat from the media and City Hall, however, and wanted to show everyone that the department was making headway. Politics and homicide, water and oil, they should never mix, but they often do. Way too often. East Los Angeles is home to a high density of Hispanic immigrants. The shops lining its streets are decrepit yet brightly painted. The houses are small and shabby, and the people are naturally distrustful of outsiders. As night fell over L.A., the killer slipped into East L.A. on Whittier Boulevard and crept north past the storefronts and tall, towering palms. At 9 p.m., he parked in the parking lot of a bar and smoked his Crocus-Sang Headhunter. A block southwest, tiny houses dotted dirty lots overlooking narrow streets. He figured that he'd wait until 1 or 2 and then be on his way. After an hour, he was listening to a repeat of the press conference on the radio, and a man appeared at the open window. "Oh, sorry, Holmes, you gotta move," he said. The killer looked at him. He was short, bald, and wore a moustache-goatee combo. The killer reached into his coat pockets. $20, he asked. The man was unmoved. "Nah, you gotta go. This is a no-parking zone." The killer brought the woodsman up. The man saw it, his eyes widening. He backed up a step, and the killer fired. The bullet took him low in the chest, spinning him around and knocking him down. The killer put the gun away and drove off. 2 hours later, the killer watched from his car as the lights in the windows of the trailers clustered around the dirt horseshoe drive winked off one by one. The trailer he was interested in, an ancient single-wide, painted seafoam green, had been dark for an hour and a half now. At 3:10 a.m., the killer got out of the car, his murder bag slung over one of his shoulders. The soft soles of his shoes made no sound as he crossed the street, pausing when a dog barked in the distance. He waited, heart knocking, and stole into the yard at a quick crouch, his body black against the night. He crept up the stairs to the back door, the ancient treads creaking eerily beneath his feet. "Shh, be quiet. Don't tell him I'm here. Supposed to be a surprise." Slipping a ski mask over his head, he reached into his jacket pocket with one gloved hand and took out a screwdriver. He worked it between the door and the jamb and finagled it until it popped open. He pulled the door open, looked around to make sure no one had seen him, and slid inside like a shadow. The trailer was dark and redolent of musk, mold, and age. He checked the bedroom at the end of the hall to his right, but it was empty and stacked with boxes. He moved through the kitchen and the living room, the furniture looming darkly from the shadows. He'd done this so many times before that he felt no fear, no trepidation. He lived in the night and walked in darkness like he was darkness. He stopped to touch things on the way, drawing power from them like a shaman deriving energy from blessed artifacts. Nice things you got here. Be a shame if someone fucking murdered you. At the bedroom door, the Night Prowler paused, listened, heard nothing, and opened it. A single bed sat in the middle of the room, a nightstand flanking it to the left. A dresser stood against the wall. The killer went over to the figure. In the half-light of night, he saw her face, old and leathery, her eyes closed and her lips slightly parted. She must have been in her 80s, if not her 90s. The killer tilted his head to one side like a curious dog. He'd never known his own grandparents. They were all dead by the time he slithered from the womb. He was glad for that, because he fucking hated boomers. He thought they were so great. Look at me, I look like Social Security. Flashing, the killer punched her. She jerked and let out a thin, feeble moan. His anger rising, the killer snatched her by the faded red hair on her head and yanked her out of bed. She crashed against the nightstand in a flash of legs and arms. Now on top of her, he punched her again. And she went still. Before he went on, he swept the house for anything of value, but didn't find anything worth taking. "Cheap bitch," he muttered. He overturned a hutch filled with knickknacks and relished the crash of breaking glass. His anger, barely concealed at the best of times, overwhelmed him, and like a recovering drunk falling off the wagon, he gave in to the urges within. He worked his way from one end of the trailer to the other, smashing, kicking, punching. His lips curled over his teeth in a sneer of hatred as he crunched black and white photos beneath his boots. Fuck you, and fuck you. The fire within him burned bright, but also burned fast, and gradually the rage leaked from his heart like oil from a cracked transmission. When he was cold and numb again, he sat on the arm of the couch with a picture frame in his hands and stared down at the photo within. Taken in the 80s or 90s, it showed a younger version of the old woman with her family. Husband, kids, even a dog. He was surprised there wasn't a picket fence too. He looked around the seedy little trailer, and an amused smile touched his lips. "Where's your family now, bitch?" Tossing the frame over his shoulder, he went back into the bedroom. The old woman, to his shock, was not only alive, but had managed to roll onto her stomach and crawl to the phone. The knife blade of outrage he expected to feel didn't come. He was tired now, his fury spent for the night. Walking over to her, he grabbed the phone, yanked it out of the wall, and threw it across the room. Phones give you cancer," he said, and knelt beside her. She whimpered, and when he laid his hand on her back, she cringed. For a moment the killer just watched her, enjoying the way she shook and shivered. Like Scooby-Doo. Leaning over, the killer stroked her back like an evil villain petting his favorite hairless cat. "Do you want to live?" he asked. The old woman's trembling stilled, like throwing a switch. "Well, I'll let you live," he said, "but you have to do me a favor." The old woman didn't speak. "All you have to do is tell him the Night Prowler was here, okay?" Silently, she nodded. "Good girl," he said, and patted her back. He got to his feet and stared down at her for a moment, then kicked her hard in the hip. A pained scream burst from her throat, and he laughed darkly. "Remember, tell him I was here." Outside, the killer stood in the night, breathing deeply. Before leaving, he took out his trusty marker and scribbled a message on the back door. Part 5. Mary Smith lay limply in the hospital bed, her face bruised and swollen. At 89, she was as tough as she was when she was a Navy wave during World War II. "He got me when I was sleeping. I'd have beaten him up if I was awake." Kevin and Tony smiled at each other. It was June 30th, 11:35 a.m. Kevin wanted to talk to the old woman 3 hours ago, but the doctors wouldn't let him. Instead, he'd sat in the waiting room and stared down at Maria's sketch. The more Kevin thought about it, the less it made sense. Who was this asshole? And what did 1979 have to do with anything? He didn't look any older than Kevin, younger actually, so it's not like anything important happened to him on that day. When he finally got in to see Mary Smith, he was tied in knots and felt like he was going to trip and bust his face on the floor. "Do you remember anything about the attack, Mrs. Smith?" Tony asked. She shook her head. "Not much. Just that he wanted me to tell you the Night Prowler was there." She was sure that he'd been wearing a mask. Either way, the sketch Kevin hopefully presented her with meant nothing. Writing was found on the back door. "Rough stuff is what I want." That told Kevin that her attacker was indeed the Night Prowler, and not some wannabe. The department hadn't made the writing public yet. An hour later, back at the station, 2 bits of information came across their desk. One, a shooting victim in East LA, was matched by ballistics to the Night Prowler murders. He was also alive. 2, a woman out walking her dog in Mary Smith's trailer park saw the Cutlers parked across from the old woman's house, thought it was weird, and jotted down the license plate number. Kevin stared down at the number with something like rapture, blood pounding against his temples. "We got you now, you bastard. We got you now." "I put an APB on it," Reynolds said, "and go see the guy in East Los." Hector Ramirez, a squat, powerfully built, bald man with a goatee, was propped up in bed when Kevin and Tony arrived, much as Mary Smith had been. Ramirez was in better shape than Mary Smith, though. "Yeah, saw the little fucker good," Ramirez said, nodding. "He was like 25, 26, maybe a bit older." Kevin pulled out Maria Salazar's sketch and showed it to him. "Is this the guy?" Ramirez studied it for a long time before handing it back. Looks like him." "You sure?" The Mexican nodded. Yeah, that's him." Kevin's phone buzzed then. He took it out of his pocket and checked the caller ID. Captain Reynolds. "Hey, I have to take this," Kevin said, and stepped out into the hall. A man in soft blue scrubs was bent over the nurse's station, flirting with a pretty blonde behind the counter. "Hello." "It's me," Captain Reynolds said. "What's up?" The blonde smiled at something the man had said and softly shook her head. "Mayor Wilson, our lovely comrade at City Hall, just held a press conference on the Prowler." Kevin's stomach clenched. Something told him he wasn't going to like what the captain had to say. She told the press we had his license plate number. It's all over the news. Kevin's jaw dropped. What? You could imagine Reynolds nodding. Yep, now the son of a bitch knows what cards we were holding. Kevin fell back against the wall and let out a long, low sigh. Playing politics, he said. Yep, Reynolds agreed. Like I said, she's pandering to the public. And fucking over our investigation. Now, our main advantage is shut to hell. Our only advantage. Kevin could cry. In fact, he kind of did. The killer turned off the TV and sat in the gloom for a long moment, planning his next move. He'd have to get rid of the cutlass tonight. He had plates from a dozen different states in the trunk, so until then he could slap a Massachusetts tag on it and cover it with duct tape. The sketch, however, well, that unnerved him. It wasn't a very good likeness, but if a cop pulled him over in the cutlass, even with a different tag on the back, it'd be close enough. Well, he'd be all right, he decided. Nothing would happen to him before his plans came together. He was special. Better. Smarter. He'd make it. At midnight, he parked the Oldsmobile Cutlass next to the Los Angeles River. Before he left, he carved a pentagram into the soft leather dashboard and left the broken, blood-covered flashlight propped upright in the driver's seat. He even belted it in. Click it or ticket. Done, he walked 2 blocks south. Around him, low industrial buildings gave way to shops and bars. Outside a nightclub called the Lego Lounge, he jimmied the door of a red Chevy, hot-wired the engine, and drove off into the night. A mile west, he switched the Chevy's plates with a battered Toyota. Back on the freeway, he drove south, enjoying the night and the music on the radio. At Huntington Park, he left the highway and found a suburban street lined with nice homes and palm trees. At 4:21 a.m., he took his kit and walked around the back of a 2-story Spanish-style home with a red terracotta roof. He tried the sliding glass door, but there was a piece of wood in the tract, so it couldn't be opened. On the far side, he found a window that led into what looked like a den. Standing on his tippy toes, he removed the screen and lifted the sash. He expected a siren to scream out, but the night remained quiet. Climbing, he dropped silently into the living room, closed the window, went off in search of the occupant. He found her upstairs, a lone woman huddled under the covers of a massive queen-sized bed. He watched her for a long moment. She was pretty, long brown hair, pert nose, soft, feminine features. The killer licked his lips and touched the woman's bare arm, his heart pounding as he began to get aroused. She stirred and muttered something. "Wake up," he said. "Now." Her eyes flew open and she sat up. The killer punched her hard, and she fell back onto the bed. He scrambled on top of her. She let out a scream, but he cut it off, grabbing her throat and slamming his fist into her face. When the fight went out of her, he grabbed her thin nightgown and ripped it off. Her supple breasts plopped out, the areola dark in the light of the moon. Panting now, he climbed off of her, grabbed the murder kit, and pulled out a roll of duct tape. Holding her hands together, he wrapped her wrists as tightly as he could, and then he ripped it off. Knife in hand, he rolled the woman onto her stomach and yanked down his pants. He was rigid and hard. And when he thrust into her, she came alive, yelping. "You like it?" She tried to squirm away, but he grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. "Help!" she screamed. He punched her in the side. Her breath came out in an airless and she tightened around him. He nearly came. The door opened then. "Mommy?" The killer looked up. A little boy of maybe 9 or 10 stood in the doorway. He was wearing pajamas with footballs on them. "Run!" the woman screamed. The killer yanked her head back and sliced her throat open. Well, the little boy ran. Jumping out of his pants, the killer gave chase. The boy was descending the stairs when the killer caught him, grabbing the back of his pajamas and throwing him to the ground.
"Oh, you little shit,"
the killer growled. He kicked the boy in his stomach. His rage was too great to contain, and he kicked and kicked and kicked. When the boy was still, the killer went back into the bedroom, pulled his pants up, and grabbed the murder kit. The woman had rolled onto her back. Her eyes were already starting to glaze. On the stairs, the killer stuck the woodsman against the boy's head and pulled the trigger. Gunfire filled the house. Kevin Turner slept for 2 hours and was up at 7. Dylan was in the kitchen, heating up a Jimmy Dean sausage sandwich. When Kevin walked into the room, Dylan smiled. "Hey, you do exist," he said. He was wearing a pair of tattered jeans and a black t-shirt.
Don't remind me,"
Kevin grunted. He opened the fridge, grabbed a Coke, and popped the top. It was cold and good against his dry throat.
"How's it going on the Night Stalker front?"
Dylan asked.
"Night Prowler,"
Kevin corrected.
"All right, Night Prowler."
"Not as good as I'd like," he said. Briefly, he told Dylan about Mayor Watson's pandering to the press by leaking the plate number. Dylan laughed.
"What an idiot. That car's probably in a ravine in the hills somewhere now."
The phone rang.
"Hey, we got the car," Tony said. "And another 2 dead."
Kevin looked at Dylan. Dylan looked worried.
"All right,"
Kevin said.
"I'll be by your place in town."
Then Kevin hung up.
"What's wrong?"
Dylan asked.
"We found the car."
Well, Dylan smiled.
"That's good, right?"
"Well, he also got 2 more people last night." Dylan paled at that.
"Oh, that's not good."
10 minutes later, Kevin was in the passenger seat of Tony's car.
"Oh, I forgot to mention this,"
Tony said, and he handed Kevin a white envelope. The familiar blocky red writing marked it as a Prowler letter. Heart sinking, Kevin opened it.
"Kevin, greetings from the night, my friend. Have I got your attention yet? Good. Have you been reading the clues I've left you? Do you know what happened on July 27th, 1979? Do you know who I am yet? Oh, it's easy to do if you just open your eyes. The Night Prowler."
Kevin didn't realize he was clenching the note in his fist until Tony told him he was. He licked his lips, ran his fingers through his hair, and took a deep breath.
"Who are you?"
he silently raged.
"Who the fuck are you?"
Don't know how much more of this I can take," he heard himself venting. Tony laid his hand on Kevin's shoulder.
"Hey, you're fine, okay? He's not coming after you."
"Well, it's not me I'm worried about."
"He's not coming after your son. He wants you off your feet, and you know what? It's working. Get your head in the game, all right? Don't let him fuck with you like this."
Kevin took a deep breath. Tony was right. He was letting this put him off. There's nothing more detrimental to an investigation than a head case lead investigator.
"You good?"
Tony asked.
"Yeah,"
Kevin replied.
"Good."
Tony grinned and messed with Kevin's hair.
Good boy.
"You want to get shot?" Kevin asked.
"That's how you get shot."
"Oh, don't threaten me with a good time." Then they both laughed, and the mood lightened. The car was parked in a dusty lot alongside the Los Angeles River. From where it sat, Kevin could see the dark, rising skyscrapers of downtown. Power lines, utility poles, and industrial buildings surrounded them on 3 sides. The man-made river bordered the east.
"Workman saw it last night,"
Tony said. "When he got here this morning and saw it was still here, he called it in." A couple of uniforms were watching as a man in greasy overalls hooked the olds to a truck.
"Any prints?"
Kevin asked.
Wiped it clean,"
Tony said.
"God, I hate tidy,"
Kevin groused. 15 minutes later, they were standing in front of a Spanish-style house. Like every other Prowler scene, it was crawling with cops. Jensen and Lowry already swept it, Tony said. Mike Jensen and Bob Lowry were also on the Reynolds task force. Though Kevin was typically territorial, he was glad they'd handled this one, especially when Tony told him about the little boy. Chris Whitaker, 10 years old. Single gunshot wound to the head. An image of Dylan at that age flashed across Kevin's mind, and for a gut-wrenching moment, it was his little boy lying there dead. Tears threatened to well in his eyes, and he blinked them away. He couldn't wait to get his hands on this motherfucker. Captain called before I picked you up, Tony was saying. They were in the cool foyer now. The floor was tiled and the walls beige. The bodies had already been taken away, and the CSI unit was looking for evidence. He wants to see us as soon as we get back. Kevin didn't say anything. Hey, Jensen and Larry talked to any of the neighbors? Tony nodded. No one saw anything, of course. Guy next door heard a gunshot and called in, but that's it. Said he saw a car peeling off, but didn't get a good look at it. Damn. Yeah. Let's go see what the captain has to say, Kevin said, turning. You don't want to see the rest of the house? Kevin shook his head. I've seen enough to last a lifetime. In the car, Tony put it in drive and swung back toward the freeway. Over the raised highway, downtown glinted hotly in the dry sun. Why'd they put Jensen and Larry on this one? Kevin asked as Tony emerged into the traffic. We can't get them all. We've been on this thing almost non-stop since it started. Well, I, for one, am glad they let me sleep in. Kevin couldn't say that he was glad. Well, sure, he was happy he missed the wet work, but still, the captain put another set of guys on his turf, and that didn't bode well. And speaking of the captain, what did he want to see them about? Was he kicking them off the case? Kevin hoped not. He wanted to be the one to bring this son of a bitch down. He wanted to make him pay for everything he'd done. You hungry? Tony asked. No. He hadn't been hungry in days. Well, I'm starved, Tony said. He pulled up to the curb of a roadside shack with a walk-up window and got out. You want a drink? Kevin shook his head. I'm fine. Okay, then. He got in line and Kevin's mind drifted to the killer's taunts. Do your homework. Find out who I am. It's easy if you try. God, what did that mean? He was still trying to figure it out when someone walked by the car and stopped to check his phone. Kevin looked up at him, and for a second he thought he was seeing things. The man put his phone away, sensed Kevin looking at him from the corner of his eye, and started. Pete? Kevin asked. Pete Nasher grinned. Hey, Kev. Fancy meeting you here. I thought you were in Mexico. Nasher shrugged. Plans changed. Had things to do here, so I figured I'd stick around. Tough break, Kevin said. Nasher shrugged again. Well, it is what it is. Hey, you free tonight? You can have a drink on me. Nah, I'm busy, Kevin replied. Too bad, Nasher said. Anyway, gotta shake a leg. See you. Bye, Kevin said. A few minutes later, Tony came back and Kevin slid behind the wheel to drive so that he could eat. When they pulled up to headquarters, the first thing Kevin noticed was the traffic. A crush of vans from every news agency in the city blocked the street. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. Reporters stood on the sidewalk talking to men with huge cameras on their shoulders. Kevin spotted a van marked CNN and groaned. God, it was turning into a circus. Tony parked at the curb and cut the engine. Looks like we're going to have to fight our way through. Outside in the arid July heat, Kevin scanned the crowd. A bubble-headed bleached blonde glanced over and seemed to recognize him, which was impossible, right? As he walked up the wide stone stairs, media jackals shoved microphones in his face. Detective Turner, is it true 2 more people were killed last night? Do you know who the Night Prowler is? Kevin ignored them. In the lobby, he sagged against the door. "Hernias," Tony said, and Kevin nodded. In the bullpen, Tony knocked on Captain Reynolds' office door. "Enter." Reynolds was sitting behind his desk like a sea captain on a voyage to nowhere, the light blue walls laden with framed pictures, certificates, citations, and motivational posters. "Did you talk to the reporters?" he asked as they sat. "No," Kevin said. "Good." And he nodded. For a moment he was silent, contemplative. Then he sighed and shook his head. "Things are starting to get out of hand. We got those assholes camped outside, and now people are seeing the Prowler everywhere. We had 50 calls last night. One lady saw a shadow on her blinds and almost had a heart attack. Turns out it was a tree in her backyard. Been there 30 years. Kevin nodded. The city was starting to panic, and he couldn't really blame it. Here was a guy who slipped into houses in the middle of the night and brutally murdered whoever he found. No one was safe. The mayor's talking about bringing in the National Guard. Wants a goddamn curfew. She's been riding my ass since day one. It's all politics. Only thing that matters to her is how many votes she gets on election day." Kevin nodded. "Well, we keep turning up empty-handed, and the task force is twiddling its thumbs. Turner, I'm putting you in charge. I know you want this guy more than anyone, so go get him." Well, the words came out so quickly that for a moment Kevin couldn't quite process them. "Me?" he asked finally, and Reynolds nodded. "I want to meet later on. Delegate tasks, that kind of thing. If we don't have anything by next week, our lovely Fuhrer in City Hall will have the army shelling Wiltshire. So you go catch this guy, okay?" Kevin nodded dumbly. Just past noon, the killer piloted the stolen Chevy along Ridge Road, which snakes through the rugged hills surrounding the city. From here he could see Los Angeles spread out before him like a metal blanket. Beyond, nearly lost in the haze, the Pacific glinted in the afternoon sun. The killer missed the olds and its satellite radio. No more Hair Nation for him. Today he was listening to a classic rock station playing the kind of boring, overrated crap he was sick of years ago. He'd already heard 3 Led Zeppelin songs and was currently working through his second Billy Idol track. Narrow and pockmarked with holes and fissures, the highway wound southeast past overgrown hillsides and the occasional McMansion. He'd always liked the hills. Looking out over the city, he felt powerful, the way a Greek god in Olympus must feel gazing upon the jagged Athena coast. He made his first kill in the hills above L.A., becoming the killer instead of the dreamer. Her name was Tanya, and she was beautiful, tall, graceful, with long dark hair and hazel eyes. Her skin was warm and bronzen, and her lips tasted like candy. They were both freshmen in high school then. When he'd driven her into the wilds, he hadn't intended to kill her. He'd only wanted a quiet place to fuck her. But when she mounted him, his hands went instantly to her soft, fleshy throat, almost of their own volition, and as Korn's twisted transistor blared from the speakers, all crashing guitars and screaming vocals, he strangled her, his teeth bared and his chest pounding. Oh, she fought hard, but her head eventually lolled, and her hands fell limp. When he was done, he dragged her out into the grass and left her there for the vultures. As far as he knew, they'd never found her. Presently, he recalled the way he'd felt after the kill, shaky and trembling, surging with power and lust. He knew then how he'd become famous. No, scratch that. He knew then how he'd become infamous. Writing, art, music, none of that really fulfilled him. He didn't enjoy it. But he did enjoy killing. It was a shame he'd have to give it up so soon. Out of the hills, Ridge Road meets Westwood Drive, a long, rural stretch of highway salted with farms, trees, rocks, and the occasional house. Turning east, the killer followed westward for 3 miles before turning onto Wedge Road. Halfway down, a stone's throw from the city, but seemingly as isolated as the peak of Mount Everest, an old frame house with a canted porch loomed from the bush. An addition had been added since the last time he was here. A long, low shotgun shack jutting from the southern wall. Several boys lazily tossed a football in the front yard. A portly man with a beard and glasses watching from the sidelines. Judas Priest came on the radio then, and the killer turned it up. It was a sign. At the end of the road, the killer turned right. Behind him, the group home waited. As he drove back into the city, the killer searched his memory. When he was in school, a friend of his, if he could be called a friend, was sent to the group home for selling drugs in the hallway, and his friend told him all about it. 6 boys, juvenile delinquents, lived under the watchful eye of 2 to 3 staff members, their every move regulated. He visited the group home once. The house itself was nice. A big living room and dining room, stairs leading up, 4 bedrooms, a narrow set of steps leading into the kitchen. If anything would put him on the map, push him head and shoulders above not only the faceless masses but also the Geens and Dissolvos of the world, it would be the murder of 9 people at once. Speck did the same thing in the 60s and was lost forever, but he also wasn't the Night Prowler. One last blast of blood and glory before the final blow. Tonight, the killer thought, and smiled. Part 6. The Night Prowler task force was housed in a conference room several doors down from the bullpen. It was a wide room with dark blue carpet and light blue walls that Kevin thought were endlessly ugly. The big conference tables had been pushed aside and replaced with several small round tables. Corkboards were arranged here and there, bearing pictures of victims, maps of the Prowler's kills, and 1,000 other things that Kevin couldn't process all at once. About a dozen men were huddled around the tables. When they entered, they looked up. To Kevin, they looked like the stereotypical task force, their shirts rumpled and their sleeves pushed up their arms. Well, things got off on a bad note. Both the olds and the plates were stolen and couldn't be directly traced to the killer. CSI found a partial print on the dashboard, but it wasn't enough. Hair fibers that were roughly the same length and color as the killer's came back as phony. He wears a wig, Kevin said as he read from the report. He and the others were gathered around the table with cans of Coke, half-eaten sandwiches, and bleary eyes. The task force hadn't been assigned an extension number yet, but Kevin fully expected that once they were, they would be flooded with calls, most of them a hindrance rather than a help. Despite all that, knowing that the killer wore a wig was a major breakthrough. Kevin had a sketch done of the killer with shorter hair, and the sense of familiarity grew stronger. The nose and chin kept throwing him off, though. He sent a sketch artist to do more pics so they could see him with every possible facial feature, and then Kevin was sure that he'd recognize this fucker. At the end of lunch, Kevin sent his men off on their own little side quests and finished his sandwich at the computer. He was doing this when Captain Reynolds popped his head in. "Your boy's here." Kevin nodded, put down his pastrami on rye, and followed the captain into the bullpen. Dylan was waiting by the desk, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Kevin had called the boy earlier to bring him an overnight bag. He was dressed in a red t-shirt and black jeans. When he saw Kevin, he winced. "Wow, you look like crap." "Thanks," Kevin said, taking the bag. "Well, I tried to fit the whole house in there, but no dice," Kevin said, smiling and shrugging. "This is fine." Back in the conference room, Detective Myers, a short, balding man who'd been on the force since the 80s, waved Kevin over to one of the tables. Detective Cho, a tall Asian, was sitting at a computer. "We might have something," Myers said. Kevin leaned over. "What?" "I was reading the first note again, and something struck me," Cho said. "What?" "He was quoting song titles," Cho said. "Mainly AC/DC songs, so I checked the messages he left at the second murder scene." On the computer, a blown-up image of the bloody wall appeared. July 27th, 1979. AC/DC released an album that day, according to Google. Highway to Hell. Yeah, one of the tracks was Night Prowler. Kevin went cold as a memory stirred in the back of his mind. He knew who it was. Jesus Christ, he knew. Of that he was certain, but
He just couldn't remember. There was something to do with AC/DC, something recent, something that stood out. However vague it was in his memory. Yes, he knew. Licking his suddenly dry lips, Kevin asked, "Hey, what are their other songs?" Joe held up a print-off and Kevin took it with trembling hands. All of AC/DC's songs were listed in 4 neat columns. He saw titles like High Voltage, Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be, Have a Drink on Me, and Shake a Leg. Another memory came to him, this one dancing mockingly on the tip of his mind's tongue, stubbornly lodged there like a pebble in a shoe. He racked his brain, and in a sonic flash of revelation, it came to him. "Hey, you doing anything tonight? Can have a drink on me?" "Well, I gotta shake a leg. Oh, I'm gonna have a lot of fun." And Kevin's blood turned to ice water. "I know who it is," he said. The final play began at sundown. It made the killer sad to begin wrapping up the fun, but he knew it was for the best. If you stayed around too long, you got old and tired, and no one cared anymore. But if you went out young, at the top of your game, they loved you forever. Don't be an Elvis, he always said. Be a Jim Morrison. Driving slowly, the killer retraced that route he'd taken earlier in the day. Not because it was the only way to get to the group home, but because he needed to kill time. At one point along Ridge Road, he stopped and admired the lights of the city before him, twinkling in the darkness. As he was gazing over LA, a car passed in the opposite lane, its headlights washing over him. A moment later, he caught a flash from the corner of his eye and turned. The car was pulling a U-turn. It was a police cruiser. "Oh, shit," the killer muttered. Lights flashing now, the cop car pulled in behind the Chevy and the cop got out, a tall man in a black uniform. "Little pig, little pig." "Well, good evening," the cop said, walking up to the back of the car. "Hi," the killer said, smiling. "I just saw you parked here. Thought I'd give you a friendly warning. Someone comes around that bend too fast and you're done." "Oh, I'm sorry, officer," the killer said. "I was just admiring the lights." "Yeah, they're beautiful, aren't they? You know, there's a nice place to watch them just up the road." But before the killer could reply, a sudden compulsion overcame him. He yanked the woodsman from his waistband. The cop froze as the killer swung the gun up. At the last minute he came alive, ducking out of the way and pulling his own gun out. The killer's first shot went wild. The second struck the windshield. Diving behind the open driver door, the cop squeezed off 2 shots in rapid succession. The killer dropped behind the front end of the Chevy, his head low. If he hesitated too long, the fuck would call for backup and he'd lose the upper hand. Leaning into the open, the killer fired 2 more rounds. The first took out the driver window, showering the pig with broken glass, and the second slammed into the door. The cop screamed. Acting fast, the killer, crouching low, scurried to the back of the Chevy, using its ass as cover. "It's now or never. Finish him." Somehow the cop knew he was there, and when he jumped up, he fired twice. One bullet was lost in the night. The second struck the killer in the shoulder. The killer screamed and almost dropped the woodsman. Buoyed now, the cop sprang up like a whack-a-mole. The killer raised his own weapon and fired just as the cop squeezed off one final shot. As the bullet grazed the killer's head, the cop's head jerked back and he collapsed to the pavement. Screaming, the killer fell to his knees and pressed his hand against the side of his head. No blood, but it hurt like a bitch. Furious, the killer got to his feet and went around the front end of the police car, ready to spring back should the cop still be in the mood for a fight. He wasn't. Lying on his back, the cop was unconscious. The killer dropped to his knees and felt for a pulse. When he felt one, weak and erratic, he wrapped his hand around the cop's throat and squeezed.
his fingernails digging into the soft, pulpy flesh. When he was certain the cop was dead, he stumbled back to his feet. The car came around the bend, heading toward Westwood Drive, its headlights blinding. Oh, fuck. What next? The killer raised the gun and stepped into the road, and the car came to a screeching halt. Keeping the gun trained on the windshield, the killer circled around the front of the car and ripped open the door. The man inside, a preppy upper-crust type in white tennis shorts and a pale yellow polo shirt, raised his hands. Hey, you can have it. Shut the fuck up, the killer said. He grabbed a handful of the man's shirt and dragged him out, throwing him to the ground. He aimed the gun at his chest. Well, the man started to babble something out, but the killer fired. A red hole appeared in the man's stomach, and the second shot dissolved his face. For a moment, the killer basked in the crashing silence following the last gunshots. Below him, the city moved ever on. He started toward the Chevy, but stopped. The dash cam. He had to destroy it. Stepping over the cop's body, the killer reached into the car and ripped the cords out of the camera. Grabbing the shotgun mounted to a rack between seats, he stepped back, chambered around, and fired into the dash panel. It exploded in a flash and crackle of technological death. Still carrying his shotgun, the killer staggered back to the Chevy and got in. Quiet Riot was on. Bang your head. Mental health will drive you mad. The killer checked his shoulder. Blood oozed forth. Tossing the shotgun into the passenger seat, he threw the car into gear. As long as he made it through the night, he'd be fine. Just 6 more hours. After reloading, the killer dumped the Chevy at the bottom of Ridge Road, taking only the shotgun and the murder kit. A half-mile down the street, a 7-Eleven glowed like a ship in the night. He couldn't just walk up there with a shotgun, so, regretfully, he dropped it at the side of the road. At one of the gas pumps, an old man was just climbing into the cab of a light green 1970 Ford pickup. Woodsman in hand, the killer opened the passenger door and slid in. "What the hell are you doing?" the old man asked. The killer shoved the pistol into his face. "We're going for a ride." All right. Where to?" "Away." As they drove into the night, the killer said, "I'm the Night Prowler. I just killed a cop." The old man looked at him. "That's so?" "It is." When they were far enough away from the lights, the killer said, "Pull over and get out." "Yes, sir." The old man came to a stop in the middle of the road. He opened the door and climbed out. "Oh, one more thing." Stupidly, the old man looked back. "What's that?" The bullet drove him back into the night. The killer slid across the bench seat and took the wheel, peeling off. It was closing in on 9 o'clock now. If he didn't hurry, he wouldn't be able to do the group home the way he wanted, lights on and people awake. He took a side street and doubled back. He thought about going back for the shotgun, but decided against it. 10 minutes later, he pulled the truck into a stand of bushes down from the group home and killed the lights. CCR was playing Green River. Digging in his bag, the killer found the ski mask and knife. Ready, he got out and started for the house, moving stealthily through the bushes. When he came to the edge of the overgrowth, he paused. Ahead, the side door of the group home was lit by a burning porch lamp. A big green 12-seat van stood idly in the shadows. Moving quick, his shoulder bothering him still, the killer crossed into the yard and ducked into a stand of vegetation below a window. His shoulder ached like a bitch. Risking being seen, the killer poked his head up and gazed through the window. A pool table occupied most of the room. To his left, a black boy with an afro was engrossed in an Xbox. All he had to do was glance over and he'd see him, but the little fuck was lost. Party time. The killer crept back around to the door and tried the knob. Amazingly, it turned. The killer eased it open and slid in. Ahead, an open archway led into the living room and the foyer beyond. You could just see the spindles of the staircases. You could hear voices close by, talking and laughing. A man, a woman, a boy or two. The boy was sitting in an armchair. On the screen, waves of alien invaders dropped from the sky. Being as quiet as he could, the killer crept up behind him. He raised the gun, savored the moment, and brought the handle down on the kid's head as hard as he could. The kid fell forward, the controller still clutched in his hands. The wires dragged the game system and TV down on top of him. The talking stopped.
"Toby,"
a woman asked,
"what was that?"
Bloodlust ran through the killer. He dropped to his knees and hit the kid with the gun again and again, the jarring vibrations snaking up his arm and hurting his shoulder. He didn't care, though.
"Oh my God!"
The killer turned. A fat woman with spiky hair was standing in the doorway. The killer raised the gun and fired. The bullet took her in the gut, knocking her aside. He was on his feet then, running, jumping over her crumpled form. Two boys, one white and the other black, were getting up from the couch, and when they saw him, they froze.
"I'm the Night Prowler,"
the killer said. He raised the gun and fired. A small red hole appeared in the black boy's head. Blood and brain painted the wall behind him. The white boy threw his hands up as the killer fired once, twice, 3 times. Something was happening to him. He was losing control, trembling, panting. An office opened off the dining room. The same man he'd seen earlier was there. He threw a stapler. The killer ducked, but couldn't avoid it entirely, and it hit him in the nose. Hot agony exploded into his brain. Momentarily stunned, the killer fell back, and the old man rushed him, tackling him like an NFL linebacker. They fell back into the living room, the old man on top of him.
"Get off of me,"
the killer roared. But the old man cocked his fist back. The killer jabbed the pistol into his stomach and fired. The old man's eyes went wide, and his face went white. Screaming, the killer pushed him off and got to his feet.
"You fucker,"
he lashed out, kicking the old man in the stomach. He kicked him again, this time aiming for the head. And with a sickening crack, his neck snapped. He kicked him one more time for good measure. Panting, the killer looked around. The front door stood open, and beyond he could hear screaming. While the old man was on him, the rest of the boys must have gotten away. Oh, fuck, he couldn't go after them. Cursing, the killer slipped back out into the night. Kevin sat tensely in front of Captain Reynolds' desk, Tony to his left. The captain leaned over the desk and listened intently to Kevin's story.
"He said he was going to Mexico,"
Kevin said,
"but I saw him the other day, and when we talked, he quoted 2 song lyrics.
Before that, when he told me he went to an AC/DC concert, I told him to have fun on his vacation. He said he would."
"Of course," Captain Reynolds said.
"Yeah, but it's the way he said it." Tony squirmed in his seat, and Captain Reynolds' mind visibly worked.
"You really think it's Officer Nasher?"
"It could just be a coincidence."
"Yeah, well, that's one hell of a coincidence," Kevin pointed out.
Captain Reynolds nodded.
"Yeah, true.
You think this is about you getting that promotion over him?"
"Could be,"
Kevin said. He was really upset back then. "Upset enough to try and ruin your life?" Captain Reynolds asked. Kevin sighed. Why did he feel he was the one on trial here?
"I don't know.
It's a guess, okay? But I do know that circumstantial evidence points to him. Has to be someone on the inside. Someone knows I had the case. And he knew." Leaning back in his chair, Captain Reynolds sighed. "Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to suspend his vacation and have him called in tonight. Then I'm going to have a man put on him 24/7.
"Look, that's not enough," Kevin said. "We need a warrant or—"
Captain Reynolds held up a staying hand. "We have no hard evidence. You need to find some if you want him arrested." Kevin sighed. Finding evidence in this case had been nearly impossible. This killer was tidy. As tidy as a cop. After a while, Captain Reynolds dismissed them and they returned to the task force office. By then, Cho had dug up everything on Peter Nasher. Conduct reports, psych evals, even his high school records. Kevin and Tony pored over them but found nothing to directly link him to the murders. Kevin checked his schedule and found that he was off duty at the time of the first murder, and the night Ray Mancini, the first official victim of the Night Prowler, was shot. Staring at a photo of him, Kevin imagined him with long hair, glasses, and prosthetics, and the likeness was uncanny. "You really think it's Pete?" Tony asked and sat back. Kevin considered his reply for a long time. Well, there wasn't much to go on, but his gut told him that it was Nasher all right, and his gut was right more often than it wasn't. "Yeah," Kevin said. "Yeah, I do." Captain Reynolds called a few minutes later to say that Nasher wasn't answering his phone and that he was sending a squad car over. "He's probably out hunting," Kevin said. You might be right," Captain Reynolds replied. Later on, the news of a cop being shot on Ridge Road swept through the department. Kevin didn't immediately associate it with his investigation until Captain Reynolds called again. "Another man was shot not far from Ridge Road. He survived, and he said, the Night Prowler did it." Kevin's stomach twanged. "Also, cop who got shot? He's friends with Nasher. Maybe you recognized him." 15 minutes later, Tony and Kevin were at Cedar Sinai Hospital talking to the survivor of tonight's attack. He was sitting up in a bed in the busy emergency department, his face pale and haggard. A lump of bandages covered his wound, and a too-big hospital gown swallowed his not inconsiderable frame. "I'm Detective Turner. This is Detective McBride." The old man nodded. "John Harker." He was beefy with a bald head and a white beard. "And you said the Night Prowler did this?" Harker nodded. Carjacked me at the 7-Eleven. Said he was the Night Prowler and he'd just killed a cop." Kevin's stomach rolled. "You had a good look at his face?" Tony asked. "Kinda," Harker said. "It was dark." Kevin produced Maria Salazar's sketch of the killer, and Harker looked it over before nodding. That's him. Shorter hair, though." On a hunch, Kevin showed him a pic of Nasher. "Do you think it could have been this guy, just disguised?" Harker glanced over the picture. "Maybe," he said. "Body type's about the same." Well, that's what Kevin thought. Back in the emergency room, Kevin's phone rang. "Hello?" It was Captain Reynolds. "It looks like the Prowler just struck again." "Again? Hey, where?" Reynolds gave him the address. "Hey, that's less than 2 miles from the end of Ridge Road," Tony said. "Come on." They ran across the parking lot and jumped into their car. As Kevin whipped out and headed for the scene, Tony stuck a detachable siren to the roof. In 15 minutes, they were parked in front of an old brick 2-story along a dark stretch of road. Several ambulances had backed up to the front door, and about 1 million cops were scurrying this way and that. Sergeant Liu was there. When he saw Kevin and Tony, he sighed. "We've got to stop meeting like this." "What happened?" Kevin asked. "What do you think? Someone in a ski mask came through the side door," he gestured, "and went to work. 4 dead. One of the Vics managed to rough our guy up a little before he got away." "Survivors?" Liu nodded. "Yeah, 3. While the Prowler was occupied, they got out." "Good," Kevin said. Across town, Dylan Turner came through the front door of his house, made a pit stop in the bathroom, and went into the kitchen. The dim track lights overhead dappled the silvery surface of the fridge as he opened it and reached for a pitcher of orange juice. He poured himself a glass, took a long, grateful drink, and then went into the living room. He'd been out for most of the day, and it felt good to finally be home again. Like any teenage boy, he loved excitement, but kicking back and relaxing was good too. His phone buzzed, and he took it out to find a text from his girlfriend, Lyra. He texted her back, kicked his feet onto the coffee table, and stared at the darkened TV screen. He was kind of tired and thought he might take a nap. It was still early and he had time. He leaned his head back against the padded cushion fringing the top of the couch and closed his eyes. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway, its burning headlights splashing across the closed garage door. They extinguished, and a shadow-clad figure threw open the driver's side door, slipping out with cat-like silence. The figure eased the door closed behind him and went up the walkway. At the frosted glass front door, he peered inside, cupping his hands to either side of his face, and then boldly rang the doorbell. Dylan jolted awake and shot a nervous glance at the door. He could see the watery outline of someone waiting on the step, and a pit opened in his stomach. He wasn't expecting company. For a moment he sat there, staring. Then he forced himself to stand. He approached the door, heart hammering. Maybe it was Lyra. Yeah, she was coming to surprise him. I mean, who else would it be? Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and opened it. The man standing on the step wasn't Lyra. "Hey," the Night Prowler said. Part 7. Ever since this Night Prowler shit started, Lyra Mason hated being home alone. 17 and tall, with dark hair, brown eyes and freckles that she hoped would fade with age and the elements but never had, Lyra wasn't the kind of girl who needed external stimulation to get along. Artistic by nature, she possessed a vivid imagination and could entertain herself for hours, perhaps even days on end. She enjoyed hanging out with friends, what teenager doesn't, but she also enjoyed being by herself. She'd always felt safe, happy, and relaxed when she was alone. Until now. It was late in the evening and the sun had long ago withdrawn into the Pacific and dark night had fallen on a city in terror. A certain sense of foreboding hung crackling like electricity in the air, and every shadow bristled with ominous potential. Since the killings began, people had been afraid. As soon as the sun set, they'd hurried off the streets and hid behind locked doors like characters in a vampire movie, and every little sound sent them running for their phone or gun. Lyra waved off the threat of the Prowler, but deep down she was scared too. So scared that she almost wished her parents hadn't left town. Like, wow, you're really going to leave me alone right in the middle of a killing spree? Thanks, guys. Lyra had always been a child of the night, coming alive at sunset, but tonight she was tense and nervous. She sat in her bed and tried to lose herself in an old John Saul paperback she'd yoinked from her parents' room, but her eyes would drift to the window and her mind would start to play tricks on her. Was that a sound she'd heard? Oh God, why is there a shadow on the blinds? She could imagine the Prowler creeping around the house, looking for a way in, and that thought was enough to drive her from bed to check all the doors and windows. Each time, she'd found them locked. She texted with Dylan, and that made her feel better. A lot of good that would do, though, if the Prowler broke in. Presently, she was standing in front of the microwave and waiting for her burrito to be done, the smell of beef and cheese making her salivate. Being afraid really works up an appetite, something she doubted John Saul had ever pointed out. She reached her phone on the counter, but froze when she caught a flash of movement in the backyard. Her heart launched into her throat, and her nostrils flared. She tucked her hair behind her ear and leaned over the sink, scanning the darkness. The stubby palm just to the left of the window rustled in the breeze, and she relaxed. Unless the Prowler had a thing for dressing up like vegetation, she'd be good. The microwave dinged, and she jumped. Hating herself for being so anxious, she grabbed the plate from the microwave and carried it into her bedroom. She sat cross-legged on the bed, balanced the plate on her lap, and picked up her fork. On the other side of the house, a figure appeared at the frosted glass abutting the front door. The knob jiggled for a moment, and then the door popped open. A hand clad in a black leather glove crept in, seeming to taste the air like a spider. Lyra was just taking a bite of her burrito when the security system chirped. A shock of alarm cut through her, and every muscle in her body went rigid. The system only did that when someone opened the door. She waited for the alarm to start going off, but it never did. She took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. It was just a glitch, that's all. Prove it. Yeah, right. Swallowing hard, she sat the plate on the nightstand, got up and inched her way into the hall, heart slamming. Body tense, hands balled into fists that seemed too small and girly for the first time in her life, Lyra made her way to the end of the hall. She peeked around the corner. From here she could see the wall-mounted alarm next to the door. It was glowing green. Green was good. It meant go. As in, go back to your dinner, Lyra. Nothing to see here. She laughed at herself. She turned around and a floorboard creaked behind her. She seized, and a split second later something hard cracked her in the back of the skull. Dazzling white light burst across her vision and her knees went weak, spilling her to the floor. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was a ski mask, hateful eyes, and black hands reaching for her. And then, mercifully, she knew no more. Kevin Turner was waiting for the lab techs to piece together the shattered remains of the slain officer's dash cam when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't recognize the number. A spurt of ice water went through him, and his heart began to pound. Maybe it was precognition, maybe it was telepathy, or maybe he was just that good a cop. But he knew who it was before he even answered. Hello? Hello, Kevin. The voice was a low, hissing whisper, like the rattle of November wind through dead and barren trees. A pang of fear rippled through Kevin's stomach, and he swallowed around a cold lump in his throat. Listen carefully and don't say a word to anyone. I have your son. If you want to see him again, you'll do exactly as I say. Kevin's heart stopped mid-beat, and when he spoke, he realized his lips were quivering. I'm listening. I'll give you an address. Come alone and tell no one else. If you do what I say, I'll surrender. If you don't, I'll shoot your son in the head. No words had ever cut Kevin as deeply as those did. I'll do what you say, he said, and looked around, making sure he was unobserved. No one was paying attention to him. Just don't hurt my son. Stinging tears welled in his eyes, and his voice cracked. It took everything he had to keep himself from breaking down in terror. Please, just please don't hurt him. Do what I say and I won't. Here's the address. Come now. The killer recited an address, and then hung up before Kevin could respond. For a long time, Kevin sat there dumbly. And when he finally stood, his legs were rubbery, and he had to support himself on the edge of the desk. Hey, I'm gonna take a walk, he said as he passed Tony. Stretch my legs. His voice sounded normal to his own ears, but just barely. Tony nodded. 5 minutes later, Kevin was piloting the car out of the parking garage and through the throng of reporters. Before getting onto the freeway, he programmed the address into the GPS. It was on the waterfront. Worry gnawed at Kevin's stomach, and his breathing came in short, hot bursts. He'd never been as scared as he was right now, not even when Michelle was first diagnosed with cancer. Kevin was not on a first-name basis with God, but he prayed as he drove through the night. He prayed as hard as any father ever had. The address proved to be an abandoned warehouse overlooking the docks. Kevin pulled into the parking lot and cut the lights. Creeping, he pulled in behind a dumpster and killed the engine. The salty sea breeze washed over him, and waves lapped gently. In the distance, a boy dinged. Gun in hand, Kevin took a deep breath and started toward the warehouse. At a bank of loading docks, he climbed up and went to a man-sized door next to a glass window. He mashed himself flat against the alcove wall and tried the knob. It turned. Inside, the first thing Kevin noticed were the candles. A dozen were arranged in a neat semicircle along the wall directly across from the door. Their flickering lights danced over the rotting walls, sending shadows scurrying for cover in the rafters. The second was Lyra. She sat with her back against the wall, her hands tied behind her and a length of duct tape covering her mouth. Her eyes were closed, and for a horrible second Kevin thought she was dead. And then she stirred. Next to her was a boy, a burlap sack over his head. Kevin's heart jolted and he started to rush over, his paternal instincts taking control. But from the shadows a voice stopped him. No. Kevin froze. Low, menacing rock music began to drift from unseen speakers, and the flames of the candles seemed to twist and writhe to the dark beat. It was Night Prowler by AC/DC. The music had an effect on the girl. Her lids flung open and her eyes bulged from their sockets in fear. And beside her, Dylan struggled. "Come on in, Kevin," the Night Prowler said. Like a stage actor, the Night Prowler came out of the shadows from stage left, a gun in his hand. And the entire world crashed down around Kevin Turner. "Surprised?" Dylan asked. Kevin opened and closed his mouth like a fish, his mind suddenly blank. He looked at the boy next to Lyra, and Dylan grinned. "Oh, I stopped home for a nap, and Sean popped in. I wasn't planning on that, but hey, the more the merrier." Kevin tried to speak, but his vocal cords refused to work. "No." When he first saw the sketch of the Night Prowler, Kevin almost recognized his son, even with the wig and the glasses. He knew it was someone close to him, and Dylan's name was the first to come to mind. But, of course, that was crazy. Dylan was a good kid. He would never... "You mean you didn't?" Dylan mocked. The shadows across his face gave it a demonic cast. "Of course you didn't. I thought you'd at least know AC/DC was my favorite band, but hey, you failed there too." Dylan shrugged. I have a poster of them on my wall. I shit on boomer music, but metal, well, there's something about it. Something gritty and real. "Dylan," Kevin finally managed through numb lips. I... Dylan jabbed the gun closer to the girl's head. "Take another step, and she dies." Lyra moaned, and Kevin froze. Smiling, Dylan went on as the last strands of the music faded away, only to be replaced by the crunchy, good-time party music of another AC/DC track. "Well, there's a lot you don't know about me, Dad. Guess I can't blame you. You were never around to figure it all out." Those words cut Kevin like a knife. Dylan, you were always catching bad guys. They got your time, I didn't. Look around, Dad. Look around you. I did this for you." He threw out his hands like a mad ringmaster. Kevin was close enough that he could rush him and have a good chance of tackling him before getting shot. But the thought didn't even cross his mind. "I had to become one of your precious villains just to get you to pay attention to me. And boy, did it work." One corner of his mouth pulled up in a sly, evil smile. For the first time in months, maybe even years, Kevin looked at his son. He really looked at him, and he could see the deadness in his eyes, the cold, unfeeling hatred. His head spun, and for a terrible second he thought he was going to pass out. No. This wasn't Dylan. It couldn't be Dylan. No, this was someone else. Something else. Lyra was crying now. "Where were you on my 8th birthday?" Dylan asked. "My 9th. 10th. Where were you on Christmas morning? Where were you, huh? Sucking your partner off in the bullpen? Yeah, that's where you were." He was pacing now, the gun never leaving the sobbing girl's head. "All those years you ignored me. Now you're paying attention. Now you're all paying attention." He made an angry gesture then. "You'll see how much better I am. You couldn't catch me. Your partner couldn't catch me. Your pansy-ass captain couldn't catch me. None of you fuckers could catch me. I had to catch me. Just like I had to raise me after Mom died. Just like I had to do everything. His son's every word struck Kevin's heart like a barb, and hot tears welled in his eyes. He knew in a flash that it was all true. All of it. He'd known for years that he was neglecting his son. He missed so much of his life. So much. His mind flashed back to every time he'd had to put Dylan off or cancel plans with him, to every flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Crazily, he remembered a time when Dylan was 8. Kevin was working on a case file at the kitchen table, and Dylan came in and stood beside him, hands behind his back, patiently waiting to be acknowledged. "You want to play with me?" he'd finally asked. "Yeah, in a minute," Kevin had said. Only that minute turned into an hour, into a day, into a lifetime. "Dylan," he finally forced. "Dylan, Dylan put the gun to his head. "This is what you want, huh? Me to go away so you can play Batman for the rest of your life?" "Dylan," Kevin said, his voice cracking. Please stop." Instead, Dylan glared at him, his eyes sparkling with loathing. "Oh, I won't kill myself," he said. "I'll kill her and Sean and make you watch." He swung the gun around and aimed it at Lyra's head. Her eyes went wide with terror, and Kevin's instincts took over. One last time, being a cop trumps being a dad. He raised the gun and fired. The shot crashed into Dylan's stomach, knocking him back a step, his mouth a perfect O of surprise. He raised his gun toward Kevin. The second bullet slammed into his chest and spun him around. Kevin didn't see where the third one went. He was already crying. Even after the uniforms arrived, even after the ambulance came to take the girl away, even after Tony came and left, Kevin Turner held his little boy's head in his lap and wept. Okay, special shout out to all the fathers out there. Don't neglect your kids. Take that time. Work's not important. Nothing else is important. Just be there for them. Whenever you can. As much as you can, okay? Yeah, sad story. Yeah, listen to me. Don't say no, can't be there. Make the time, make the effort. Always. Yeah? It's the most important thing you can do as a parent, as a father. Trust me on that one. Well, long one. Sorry it wasn't ready for last night, but it's here now. Yeah, okay, right. Till the next time, my dear friends. Very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.